have the opportunity to take no deal off the table. Could the honourable gentleman not only confirm that, Mr Speaker, but also inform us of this? Is it the case that the government is offering a free vote on the amendment that Mr Speaker has called, which I believe is Amendment F, in the name of the Right Honourable Gentleman for Ashford, and yet it is whipping against the Amendment A laid in the name of the Right Honourable Lady from Meridian? An honourable gentleman and members opposite don't want to hear it, but it's a shameful carry-on when a former chairman of the Conservative Party is whipped against to the extent she will not push that amendment to the vote. This House will be denied the chance to take no deal off the table. That's the truth of it, isn't it?
The Right Honourable Lady is a distinguished criminal barrister. Now I know what it's like to be cross-examined by her, but I also understand why lawyers are paid by the hour. I'm going to make a
point of order, Anna Soubry.
Mr Speaker, it's debatable as to whether I was ever a distinguished member of the bar, but I can tell the Right Honourable Gentleman, as a member of the criminal bar, we were never paid by the hour when I was at the bar. In fact, repeatedly, I worked pro bono, as many criminal barristers have to do, under his cuts.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady has put the facts on the record. I don't think we get into the subject of who's been remunerated, how much, whether for legal work or penning articles in newspapers or whatever. I don't think we should get into that. That's just focused on the terms of the debate. And actually, I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, in his own interest, the less said about that matter, the better. The Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I believe, as a former Lord Chancellor, that is what is known as a refresher. But thank you. Not at this stage. Not at this stage. Oh, yes, to the Father of the House.
Just to clarify briefly, the point was concerning the Right Honourable Member for Roxton. Can the Minister confirm it is the Government's position that we are ruling out leaving on March the 29th with absolutely no arrangements at all?
Yes.
We are ruling out the complete collapse of all our legal and trading arrangements with the continent which we've built up over the last 50 years.
Yes, I wouldn't use exactly the same language as the Father of the House, but his point is correct. The motion commits the government not to leave on the March the 29th without a withdrawal agreement. I hope that is clear and unambiguous. But the motion also makes clear that the default position in law is that we do leave the European Union unless we can secure assent to a withdrawal agreement, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, it was so disappointing that we did not secure a mandate last night. I will give way, first of all, to the Right Honourable Gentleman, and then to my Right Honourable learned friend.
Could he now attempt to answer the question of the honourable member for Broxtowe and explain the media reports? Given the Prime Minister last night promised free votes on her, yes, she did, at the dispatch box, free votes, yes, don't shake his head, free votes at the dispatch box last night. Can he explain the reports that she has quoted, that the amendment in the name of the honourable member for Ashford will be a free vote on the Conservative benches, but the amendment in the name of the honourable member for Meriden will be whipped against? That is an absolute disgrace and a bad faith to this House.
If only the Labour Party would give its own members a free vote, then we could find out what they really think. Happy to give way.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend. It seems to me that the difficulty which may be arising across the House is this. If the House passes this motion this evening, and I have no reason not to support the motion in the terms of ruling out no deal, it must of course follow from that in order to achieve that, two things have to happen. Firstly, we need to get an extension to Article 50, and secondly, we were going to have to make a change to primary legislation in the Withdrawal Agreement Act. And I assume that the government is undertaking, if this motion is passed in its own terms, that it will do exactly that.
I'm very grateful, actually, to my right honourable and learned friend for his point, because it does allow me to underline and further elucidate the point. It is absolutely correct. Tomorrow the House will have an opportunity, if the motion passes tonight, to decide how to seek an extension. Obviously, an extension is not something that we can insist upon and automatically see delivered. It is in the gift of the EU, and it requires the assent of all 27 other EU members. But of course, there will be an opportunity further to debate that tomorrow. Now, I want to stress. I will give way. Oh, of course. Sorry. Yes, of course.
There was a second part to the question, which is equally critical, which is that we are going to have, the government will have to bring statutory instrument to this House to alter the departure date set out in the EU Withdrawal Act, and I assume the government is undertaking, in those circumstances, to do exactly that.
The Prime Minister and others have said that previously, and I'm happy to place once again on the record at this dispatch box exactly that commitment. Now, I do want to make a little bit of progress, but there will be time for others to intervene. I am conscious also that many members do want to speak. 40 members. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I stressed earlier that if we do choose to leave without a deal on March the 29th, there will be economic, political and constitutional challenges that this country will face. Now, we are a great country. We would get through it. We would, in due course, ensure that this country was more prosperous, freer and successful. And of course, government has been working hard in order to ensure that we can be prepared for any eventuality and we can mitigate the risks of leaving without a deal. And can I, at this stage, pay particular tribute to civil servants across government who've been working exceptionally hard and with great skill in order to ensure that we are ready for any eventuality. We don't often enough pay tribute to civil servants in this House. I'm sure that across this House, everyone will recognise how important their work is. But I stress, that work is work to mitigate the challenges. If we were to leave on March the 29th without a withdrawal agreement, we would be treated as a third country by the European Union. And that would mean that we would face tariffs on many of our products. And I'm acutely aware that some of the highest and most severe tariffs would be imposed on food. We would face, our sheep farmers and beef farmers would face, if we left on March the 29th, the instant imposition of tariffs of at least 40%, in some cases more than 100%. Their livelihoods, and indeed the economic and social health of our countryside, would face very, very challenging circumstances. None of us can be blithe or blasé about those challenges. More than that, I'm happy to give way in just a second, but I just want to complete this section of the argument. It is also the case that we know that there are at least 145,000 businesses in this country that trade with the EU, and of course do commerce in the UK, but don't trade outside the EU. As soon as we become a third country, they will need to register with HMRC in order to ensure that their trade can continue. They need, at least 145,000 of them, to secure the ORE numbers and the other documentation necessary to trade. At the time of speaking, only around 50,000 of those 145,000 businesses have made those preparations. So that means a significant number of businesses in this country, when we are just over a fortnight away from the prospect of leaving without a deal, do not have the wherewithal, the means and the appropriate documentation in order to be able to carry on trade. On top of that, it is also the case that as well as customs and other checks, products of animal origin, if they're exported to the European Union, need to be checked at a border inspection post for sanitary and phytosanitary checks. A significant amount of our food produce goes through the narrow straits and crosses from Dover to Calais or goes through Eurotunnel. It is the case that at the moment, at the time of speaking, there is no border inspection post at either of those ports. Now, of course, there are many things that this government can do to mitigate the consequences of no deal, but we cannot dictate what the EU's tariffs will be. We cannot instruct the port authorities in France how to order their affairs. We cannot compel businesses to acquire the means necessary in order to trade in the way that they have been doing. All of these are cumulative costs that businesses would face in the event of a no-deal exit on March the 29th. I'm delighted to give way to my dear friend.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and he's right that the European Union does not have border infrastructure in place to do the border inspection checks that he mentions. But is that why perhaps they've asked us to dynamically align our regulations for a period of 9 months, so that they don't have to carry out those checks during that period? Quite right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's right that, but dynamic alignment for those 9 months would mean being a rule taker during that period. It is also the case, of course, that while there would be dynamic alignment which would allow us to be registered as a third country, it would also be the case that there would be SPS checks on a variety of products. I'm very happy to give way. Oh yes, of course, the honourable gentleman.
Grateful to the Secretary for giving way. He speaks as though there is some distance between him and the tragedy that he's just outlined. But isn't it the case that he is the author, a senior author of the tragedy he has just outlined? Doesn't he feel any sense of shame and any sense of responsibility? And shouldn't he apologise for the mess that we are facing?
It's the responsibility of those who voted against the withdrawal agreement last night. If the Scottish National Party had a care for Scotland's industry, Scotland's prosperity and Scotland's farmers, they would have voted for the withdrawal agreement last night. But I'm afraid when it comes to political positioning and separatist posturing rather than serious politics, there is no equal to the ranks of the Scottish National Party. I'm happy to give way to the honourable.
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way once again. He may not be aware, but the authorities at Calais say to me that they will in fact have a border inspection post open at the end of the month. And can I urge his department to work with my port and with the community in Dover, because they want us to have a border inspection post just outside the port, just like they do in places like Rotterdam, but the unfortunately restricted position of DEFRA means that they're trying to say it has to be inside the port, which it doesn't. Can he get his department to be more flexible?
My department has been flexible, and it will continue to be flexible, and we will continue to do everything possible in order to facilitate trade. But as my honourable friend points out, that border inspection post, that it could be in place by the end of the month, and we hope it will be in place by the end of the month, is not in place now. I'm very happy to give way to my honourable friend, the member for North Dorset.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary for giving way. He knows, as I do, just how important, Mr. Speaker, agriculture is to this country and the jobs that it creates and all that it adds to biodiversity and our environment. Would you agree with my assessment that any right honourable and honourable member who purports to either A, understand or B, support farming in their constituencies can in no way support leaving the European Union without a deal?
Obviously there are a diversity of views in this House, but I do agree with my honourable friend that it is in the interest, and this is one of the reasons why I'm making the arguments at this dispatch box now, it is in the interests of British farming and indeed our broader environment that we do not leave on March the 29th without a deal. Now I'm going to make a little bit more progress. There are also political challenges in leaving on March the 29th without a deal. As my honourable friend, the member for South Leicestershire, pointed out, during the referendum campaign, we argued that we should leave with a deal. I'm also conscious that while the mandate that we had was clear, it was also the case that with a 52-48 result, we do need to take account of the hopes and concerns of those people who did not vote to leave the European Union. And the Prime Minister's deal does that. More than that, there have been many people who voted Remain, including in this House, including colleagues of mine in my party and in other parties, who accept the result and wish us to leave and to honour that mandate. But they do not want us to leave on March the 29th without a deal. It would inevitably be the case that there would be political strains and pressures consequent on leaving on March the 29th without a deal, which none of us as ministers can afford to ignore. More than that, it is also important to stress that there are significant constitutional challenges as well. It is the case, as a number of members have pointed out, that a majority of voters in Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, and a majority of voters in Northern Ireland did. But we voted as one united kingdom, and we voted to leave. It is striking that since that vote, support for the Union in Scotland has risen. Well, I think we only need to look at the ranks of Scottish Conservative MPs. Who turfed out the partitionist part-timers of the SNP to see which way the tide was flowing, and they don't like it up them. I'm more than happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful indeed to the Secretary of State for giving way. The Secretary of State will be well aware, as will other members, that we have not had a functioning assembly in Northern Ireland for over 2 years. We have had no ministers in Northern Ireland for over 2 years. And so this House must give due weight, including members of the DUP must give due weight to the warning, the serious warning that was issued last week by the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, David Stirling, of the grave consequences for Northern Ireland if there is a no-deal Brexit.
The Honourable Lady, for whom I have enormous respect, is absolutely 100% totally right. Now, of course, it is up to this House to take that decision. But it is the case, whatever the position in Scotland, and I do believe that if we left without a deal, it would impose additional pressures on our precious union. It is also the case that there would be particular pressures, particular pressures if we left without a deal on March the 29th in Northern Ireland. As the Honourable Lady points out, Northern Ireland has been without a devolved government for 2 years now. And in the absence of the Stormont institutions, we have introduced legislation and guidance from my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, which empowers Northern Ireland civil servants, including the wholly estimable David Stirling, to continue to take decisions which are in the public interest. Now, that arrangement is sustainable at the moment, but of course, it is the sincere hope of myself, my colleagues in government, and I believe almost everyone across the House, that we can restore the Northern Ireland executive. But it is not at this point. But it is also clear that the current situation with no executive would be very, very difficult to sustain in the uniquely challenging context of a no-deal exit. Now, we, in the circumstances that the House has voted for no deal, would have to start formal engagement with the Irish government about further arrangements for providing strengthened decision-making in the event of that outcome. And that would include the very real possibility of imposing a form of direct rule. Now, that is a grave step, and experience shows us that it is very hard to return from that step, and it would be especially difficult in the context of no deal. Of course.
Very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, but he will be aware of the written ministerial statement of the Northern Ireland Secretary today, which affords frictionless trade to the Republic of Ireland in terms of tariffs and in terms of no checks. If that can be the basis of no deal, why can't that be the basis of a deal? We'll say.
It is the case that my right honourable friend has issued a written statement, and it is the case that those provisions seek to minimise the consequences of no deal. But it is a temporary arrangement. It could potentially be open in the future to legal challenge. It is, to put it at its highest, a sub-optimal arrangement. It is a reflection of the hard work of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, that we will do everything we can to minimise frictions and checks at the border in order to underpin the importance of both commerce and peace on the island of Ireland. But it is emphatically not an arrangement which any of us can look at and regard as one that is genuinely sustainable or ideal. I'd be very happy to give way, to all of my honourable friends. First of all...
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and he is making a very clear case for why leaving without a deal at the end of this month brings such uncertainty. Could he give more clarity on how he sees the time could be used during an extension?
The House to decide tomorrow what type of extension it believes is appropriate. I think the most important thing that we can do is rally behind a withdrawal agreement which ensures that we can preserve not just the strength of our economy but also the gains of leaving the European Union. But it is also the case that civil servants, as I've indicated earlier, are working incredibly hard to make sure that we can mitigate all consequences. I will give way to the Right Honourable Lady in a second, not to those gentlemen, but first of all to these two.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. The written ministerial statements bearing on tariffs tabled this morning are very welcome, and in particular the zero tariff for goods travelling north-south on the island of Ireland. But what discussion has he had with Dublin in relation to tariffs for goods travelling south-north? Because he will appreciate, given the importance of agri-food in Northern Ireland, the potential grave disadvantage in the event of no deal for agriculture in Northern Ireland.
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. Of course, I talked to Michael Creed, the Minister responsible, but it is the case that there are additional challenges that agriculture and food processing in Northern Ireland would face in the event of a no-deal scenario on March the 29th. And I'm going to give way to the member for East Surrey and then the right honourable member for Pontefract and Castleford. Yes.
My right honourable friend is being incredibly generous with his time. The overwhelming view of business is that no deal should be taken off the table. And given that those of us on this benches know that our party's success and our country's success is based on backing the job creators and the wealth creators, how does he think the Conservative Party of the 1980s would look at our response to business at the moment?
Well, I think I'm fortunate enough to speak in this House after the Chancellor of the Exchequer gave a spring statement in which he underlined the fact that this country has had the longest period of uninterrupted growth of any G20 economy, that we have a faster growing economy, we're predicted to have a faster growing economy than Italy, Germany and Japan, and it is also the case that we have a record number of people in work and real wages are rising. So under my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer's leadership and the Prime Minister's leadership, I think anyone nostalgic for the 80s would say that actually what we have once more are economic success delivered by a Conservative government putting the national interest first. Happy to give way to the Right Honourable Lady and then I will make some progress.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. And he is making a very strong argument against no deal and about the damage that it would cause. The purpose of having these votes today and tomorrow was to establish the default position, that if we don't have a deal in place, and we don't have a deal with a majority behind it in this House in place, what will the default position be for on March the 29th? So could he please clarify, it's not clear from the motion, could he please clarify his position on this? If there is no deal in place by the 29th of March, does he agree that the default position cannot be to simply leave without a deal?
Motion today is designed to assert, and that's why I hope that people will support it. Now, I wanted to stress that in underlining all of these challenges, and by emphasising that we're doing everything we can to mitigate them, it is not the case, and I made this point earlier, and I just want to underline it for the benefit of all, it is not the case that we are taking no deal off the table. The only way that that can be done is either to revoke Article 50 and decide to stay in the European Union, or to conclude an agreement. That is an inescapable fact, and that is why we face a series of unattractive choices. And many of the alternatives that have been put forward would undoubtedly be worse. No. It is the case that the Labour Party is now committed to a second referendum, and indeed there's been no more impressive no more articulate advocate of that position than the honourable gentleman. No, nay, never.
Order. Well, the Secretary of State's made the position clear. Let me conduct the very briefest of tutorials for the benefit of the illustrious chair of the International Trade Select Committee of the House of Commons. It is unseemly, to the point of being disorderly, to try to speak one's intervention by mouthing it before permission has been given to undertake it. It is a point that is so blindingly obvious that, as I often observe, only an extraordinarily sophisticated person, possibly from Anhelian and Yar, could fail to grasp it. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I'm so grateful you're in the chair. The Labour Party are now committed to a second referendum. But it is the case that many of their leading spokespeople had made clear what they thought of a second referendum in the past. The Shadow Education Secretary had said that it would be a mistake and would show a disdain for democracy. And indeed, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, the member for Islington South, when asked about a second referendum, said, no, we don't think that's right. If we went for a second referendum, we would be saying to people, we think you're stupid. We think you made the wrong decision. We're going to do something else. So, now that she embraces a second referendum, I'm afraid that the Honourable Lady, having sneered once at the flag of St George, now confirms that she wants to tell the British people that they are, in her view, wrong and stupid. That may be a view popular in Islington South. It is not the view of this government, who are determined to honour the votes of the British people and who will not dismiss their sovereign decision as either wrong or stupid. No. I'll tell you one thing that's worse than Jeremy Corbyn, and that's the prospect of an independent Scotland with the gaggle of, as I said earlier, part-time politicians in favour. But there is one thing that's better than Jeremy Corbyn, and that is the Honourable Gentleman.
I take compliments wherever I can find them, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State and the Prime Minister have said at the dispatch box previously and today that the House is very good at striking down things that are on the table, but very bad at putting forward alternatives. I've noticed in recent days that both of them have been doing exactly the same thing. They spend a lot of time striking down any other proposition that is mentioned from across the House. But the one they're sticking to has also been decisively struck down, more than any other, twice in historic proportions. If we carry on doing the same thing, we're going to get the same result. Is he suggesting that he's going to bring the bill back again and again and again, the deal, or is he going to suggest that he's going to show the leadership that is expected from somebody in his position and the Prime Minister's position and change course, listen to other propositions and engage with people who are trying to compromise?
Well, I said before that the Honourable Gentleman was better than Jeremy Corbyn, and he proved by his intervention that he's much, much better than Jeremy Corbyn. And I don't agree with him on everything, but I do think it's right that we have dialogue across this House. We are in an uncomfortable position. Now, I was a supporter, an enthusiastic supporter of the Prime Minister's deal. It commanded more votes last night than it did at the first time of presentation. But it did not command a majority in this House, absolutely. And that is why it is our responsibility, all of our responsibilities, yes, to listen, yes, to reflect, but also to recognise that none of us can dodge choices. And the choices in front of this House as a result of the decision not to endorse the Prime Minister's deal last night are unattractive. And I have laid out just how unattractive some of them are. There is another proposition that has been put forward.
Interrupting the right honourable gentleman, I hadn't heard, but I have now. Point of order, Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has just made it clear that the government's intention is to keep putting the same deal back to the House over and over and over again, even though it's been decisively defeated twice now, possibly ad infinitum. Isn't that out of order?
There are historical precedents for the way in which such matters are regarded. I don't need to treat of them now, and no ruling is required now. There may be people who have an opinion about it. I'm not really preoccupied with that, but a ruling would be made about that matter at the appropriate time, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for reminding me that such a ruling might at some point in the future be required. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In just a second. For the benefit of the Right Honourable Lady, I'm simply making clear that as a result of last night's vote, We face a series of unpalatable choices. Now, the government has put forward a motion tonight, which I hope right honourable and honourable members will support, and that would ensure that we do not leave on March 29th without a deal. But this House has to decide. It has to decide what it wants, and that is why I agreed with the honourable gentleman. This House has been very good at saying no, and insufficiently statesmanlike in supporting the Prime Minister in her efforts. It is now make your mind up time for this House. It is critical that members on all sides respond appropriately. No, but I will give way to the chairman of the Exiting the European Union Select Committee.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Can he explain to the House why it is democratic to keep bringing back to the House a proposition that has been overwhelmingly defeated on 2 occasions, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is somehow undemocratic to suggest that the British people should be asked whether they want to change their mind?
I'd point out 2 things. The first is that the proposition that was put before the House last night was significantly different from the proposition that was put before the House beforehand. I think the honourable gentleman, the member for Brett North, taxes me about stupidity. I'll return to his comments in just a second. But the key thing is, it was different, but of course we didn't secure support for it. So the House now has to decide. But it is the case, and I respect the right honourable gentleman, as he knows very, very much, but it is the case that it was the official position of his front bench not to endorse a second referendum. They've done what might inelegantly be called a flip-flop or a U-turn, and I was merely pointing out to the House the nature of that flip-flop and U-turn. No. Oh, yes, of course, yes, absolutely.
My honourable friend is very kind. He keeps saying that if we reach March the 29th, we're not going to leave unless we have a deal, and then he's been considering the alternatives, because doing nothing means we will, at the moment, by law, need a deal. The one he keeps suggesting is revoking. Is that because we could seek an extension if this House by then has some idea of what it's seeking an extension for, but the EU might refuse it? Is he prepared to contemplate, is it the government's position, that if the EU refuses an extension, we will revoke it, no doubt with the intention of invoking it later, once this Parliament and the government have decided what it is we're seeking for our future?
The Father of the House makes an important point, but what we cannot do is revoke Article 50 and then invoke it later. The European Court of Justice has made that absolutely clear. That is why we need to come to a decision. No. I will give way to the honourable lady.
State for giving way. If the government is serious about engaging with alternatives to the deal that we voted on last night and serious about listening, why won't the government grant a series of indicative votes as recommended by the Exiting the EU Select Committee, which I sit on, that my honourable friend chairs? Why won't the government do that to determine the will of the House?
The honourable lady makes an important point. I think that depending on how the House votes today, we may have an opportunity to vote on that proposition tomorrow. But one of the things that I think is important is that we, as quickly as we possibly can, find consensus. Now, one of the...
Joanna Cherry. Mr. Speaker, I think the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Secretary of State, has got confused between the ruling of the Court of Justice and the preliminary opinion of the Advocate General. It was the preliminary opinion of the Advocate General which suggested that once Article 50 was revoked, it couldn't be implemented again, whereas the Court of Justice's opinion does not say that. Now, Mr. Speaker, given that this is a judgment of the highest court in Europe, how can I put the record straight, as the Secretary of State seems to have misunderstood the judgment?
From the material disadvantage of not being a point of order, the honourable and learned lady has made her point. Legal exegesis as between a court and an Advocate General is not a matter for the chair, and I would... go so far as to say that it is well beyond my limited capabilities. I'm grateful to the honourable lady for elevating me to a level of prowess that I cannot profess. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It was very revealing of the Scottish National Party's position. They want to be in and then out, in the same way as they want to be in the European Union, but out of the common fisheries policy. We now know that the SNP are the hokey-cokey party. In, out, shake it all about. No, I think we've had. I think we've had more than enough. I think we've had more than enough from the collection of circus acts of the Scottish National Party.
The honourable gentleman is a distinguished member of the House of Commons Commission, and I hope, therefore, his point of order is authentic and genuine. Point of order, Mr. Stewart-Hosey.
As authentic as almost everybody else's. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has just said we know what the SNP are, what they believe in, what their positions are. On a point of order, can I ask, how can the Secretary of State know that if he refuses to engage in debate? Instead simply behaves like a little primary school bully, refusing to take proper engagement, hiding behind the big boys who are sitting behind him.
Secretary of State is invested with psychic powers. I have no way of knowing. I'm about to say to the honourable gentleman, though, in my dealings with the Secretary of State, I've never regarded him in any way as a bully. He is sometimes insistent upon his point of view, but I must say I've never found him remotely pressurising. Dealing with him isn't difficult at all. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much for that generous encomium, Mr. Speaker. I'm always happy to debate the SNP. What I'm not happy to do is to allow the time of this House, when there are so many other serious speakers who want to make their points, to be absorbed by repetitious and self-serving chicanery from the representatives on those benches. Now, I wanted to turn to one other proposition that has been put forward as an alternative, and that is the position of the official opposition, which isn't shaped by an amendment today, but is their policy, which is that we should be members of a customs union. But what is striking about the position that they put forward for the customs union is they say in that customs union we should be able to offer businesses state aid that we are not able to offer within the EU. Well, that would be illegal. They also say that we should have a voice in that customs union in the EU's negotiation of trade deals. Well, no such voice for any member of the customs union who's not a member of the EU exists. They also say that we should have independent trade remedies separate from those that the EU provides.
I'm sorry. I was very generous. I'll take the point of order. I was very generous to the Secretary of State. We all enjoy his rhetorical flourishes, and I'm not going to repeat the precise order. I'm not going to repeat the precise words, but he used a little formulation a moment ago which was very, very borderline as far as the procedures of this House are concerned. And I very gently say to him that what passes muster at the Oxford Union might not be acceptable in the chamber of the House. Point of order, Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It very much follows on from that. This is a debate about whether this House believes we should leave with no deal, and yet the Secretary of State has spent now quite some time discussing anything apart from that. I just wondered if we could get your advice about when this debate is actually going to go back onto the terms of the order paper.
Those addressing the House from the Treasury bench get a degree of latitude, but I do note what the Right Honourable Lady says, and I hope that contributions will focus on what the debate is supposed to be about, for if that were not to happen, there would have to be another debate on the matter in order to meet the terms of the commitment that has been given. And that might be inconvenient for some people, but that debate on that matter will take place. And about that, there need be no doubt on any bench, back or front. Secretary of State.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hope that I was able to outline earlier some of the real difficulties in leaving without a deal on March the 29th. It's perfectly open to members to take different views on that matter. But no. The motion, and I hope people will recognise that I've tried to take as many interventions as possible, but it is the case we must now move on in order to hear from the principal opposition spokesman, and of course to make sure that as many backbenchers as possible have their voice heard. No. But I think it's important that all of us in this House recognise that as a result of the vote last night, there are no easy options, no attractive choices left. I hope in the debate today, and inevitably in the debate that follows tomorrow, we all take the responsibilities of representing our constituents as seriously as possible. We all need to recognise that leaving on March the 29th without a deal would impose economic, political and constitutional challenges and risks for this country that I believe that we should undertake. I therefore think it is important that all of us work across this House and across old divisions to try to seek a consensus that can unite all 4 nations of the United Kingdom and can unite all our citizens in making sure that we honour the referendum mandate and we leave the European Union in a way that is economically sensible and democratically legitimate. And that is why I commend this motion to the House.
Order. Just before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, I have now to announce the results of today's deferred divisions. In respect of the question relating to environmental protection, the ayes were 315, the noes were 235, so the ayes have it. In respect of the question relating to immigration, the ayes were 314, the noes were 276, so the ayes have it. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome today's debate. The Prime Minister is leaving, and I do know that she wanted to open this debate, and we understand why she can't. And I wanted to send our best wishes for her speedy recovery, and I'm sure that goes for the whole of the House. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister had been opening the debate, I think she would have engaged seriously in the points that were being made by others, rather than just hurling easy insults about and not engaging in those points. This is a serious debate about a very serious matter and needs to be conducted in the right way. It's a debate which is long overdue. On this side of the House, we've never accepted that there should be a binary choice between the Prime Minister's deal or no deal. Between very bad or even worse is not a meaningful choice, and it would be a very sorry end to the negotiations. Yesterday, the House overwhelmingly voted to reject the first of those options, the Prime Minister's deal. Today we have the chance to reject the second. And, Mr. Speaker, we should do so with as big a majority as possible. The mantra that my deal or no deal needs to be dead and buried tonight. I will in just a moment. Labour has always opposed a no-deal outcome. We've repeatedly warned that it would be catastrophic for jobs, for the economy, for security and for peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. And I'll come to those points later. I do give way.
Honourable Member for giving way, but can I just implore him to use the language of moderation when talking about no deal? He will remember during the referendum campaign dire economic warnings, 500,000 people extra unemployed by Christmas 2016. They didn't come about. So bad were the predictions, the Bank of England had to publicly apologise afterwards. Do not rest his case on predictions. Economic reality is dictated by comparative advantage, such as lower tax rates, more flexible labour markets, and that's why the economy, this economy, is doing so well despite the prospect of no deal.
I'm grateful. Lots of things were said by both sides in the referendum which should never have been said. Some of them by members who've already addressed the House. I will give way.
Way. And one of the things that was said time after time after time, that there will be no consequences for peace on the island of Ireland. Yes. And we have heard today from the dispatch box, I think, and maybe the Secretary of State might want to come back on it, that a consequence of the government not ruling out no deal tonight is potentially direct rule. And that is a major shift in the government's position.
Does he agree with me that those weren't fearful?
Right.
Those are now the actualities.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I will come to the position in Ireland because it was and it has been treated casually, as if it's all about a technical question of a line in the road. Anybody who spent any time in Ireland in the last 2 years will realise the impact that Brexit is having on the politics of Ireland. The politics of Ireland going well beyond the technicalities of customs union and single market. Now, that doesn't mean we should... I was going to complete my answer because I do accept that we've got to deal with the facts as they are. But one of my concerns is that because so many things were said in the referendum, there's now a licence to pretend that real risks and real outcomes won't happen by simply saying other things didn't happen. And that is a real cause for concern. I did say I'd give way.
Following on from the point of the member of Rushcliffe earlier, to the Secretary of State, the Father of the House, and also the correction by the honourable friend from Edinburgh South West to the Secretary of State, the legal correction, we're in a situation where the European Union isn't going to give any other deal. There's 16 days to go. There will be no extension beyond the end of May. And the question that the Secretary of State needs to answer, and a lot of other MPs need to answer, is whether they're going to go for no deal or they're going to go for revoking Article 50. Because that's what it's going to come down to at the end. The European Union, I was in Brussels last week, are fed up with the childish antics of the UK government. The choices are coming between two. I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman is there yet, but he really needs to get, like everybody else needs to get, between no deal and revocation. That's the games in town. Brexit is a busted flush.
I spent a lot of time talking to officials in Brussels over the last 2 years, and I've been discussing the question of an extension for 6 months because it occurred to me back then that we would be in this position. And I think we'll need to address that tomorrow, in tomorrow's debate, but for my part, I have not received the message from Brussels that there's no prospect of an extension, quite the contrary. I'm going to just make some progress, then I'll give way again in a minute. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister used to tell us that no deal wouldn't be the end of the world. Past Brexit secretaries even talked up the merits of leaving on WTO terms, or told us how crucial threatening no deal was to the negotiations. But on this side, we've been steadfast in insisting that no deal is not a viable option. Why? And here it's hard to know where to begin. First, the economy. And here the vast majority of businesses and the trade union movement speak with one voice. And that doesn't happen very often. I've been to meetings with businesses all over the country, and I've spoken to trade unions in those businesses all over the country, and I've taken notes of what they tell me. And at the end of those meetings, you could almost rub out the identity of who was in the meeting and have the same readout of their level of concerns. And that persuades me, I'm going to give way in just a minute, that persuades me that they've got a very good point and they've got a very strong case. Even today, Carolyn Fairbairn from the CBI said no deal would be a sledgehammer to the economy. Francis O'Grady from the TUC said a no-deal Brexit will be a hammer blow to our manufacturing industries and the communities they support. A no-deal Brexit could be terminal for Britain's manufacturing and thousands of skilled jobs it provides. And Mr. Speaker, as the son of a toolmaker, I remember when manufacturing was in the doldrums. But now there's been a revival. Manufacturers operate the just-in-time regime, which relies on open borders, and they do so successfully. No deal poses a huge risk to them. I will give way.
He's been talking about what may happen. It's very obvious to me that following his honourable friend's exchanges with the Secretary of State, the government are intent on bringing the withdrawal agreement back for yet another go. Can I make a small prediction? They will go to the European Council on the 20th/21st. They will plead for some additional concession, however small. They will come back to the UK, rerun Maastricht, declare game, set and match, and then try and persuade the House to vote for it. For 50 quid, For Help for Heroes, I bet the third meaningful vote will be on Tuesday, the 26th of March. Will he take my bet?
I don't gamble. Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? Earlier, the Minister referred to the 140,000 or so companies that trade exclusively with Europe, and only about 40,000 of them have registered and got their EORI numbers, which is necessary to do so. The business community has pointed out that there is no reason why HMRC couldn't give them an automatic EORI number if they are VAT registered, and most of them are, and are very worried that the government is trying to shift the blame for a chaotic no-deal Brexit away from their own lack of support to blame business.
For that intervention. It is a real cause for concern. And in all my discussions with businesses in the last 2 years, but particularly in the last 3 to 6 months, I have detected that while some of the bigger businesses have had the resource to do some planning for no deal, most of the medium and small businesses have said to me, we simply don't have the resource to do it, and therefore we haven't done it, which is among the reasons I've always said that a no-deal Brexit is not a viable option. I'll give way to the lady.
My honourable friend has said he's not a gambling man, but it seems the Secretary of State for Wales might be, and he is refusing to rule out supporting no deal. Now, if one considers Wales, its agriculture, its manufacturing industry and so much more, that is absolute madness in my view. Does the not quite a Secretary of State yet, does the Shadow Secretary of State agree with me?
I do, and it's a real cause for concern. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. My constituency of Bradford South voted to leave, and I'm a Democrat and respect the result of the referendum. But does my honourable friend agree with me that a no-deal Brexit would not be in the interest of my constituents or of this country?
Absolutely right. I don't think a no-deal Brexit would be in the interests of the constituents anywhere across the United Kingdom. I will give way in a moment, but I've given away a lot and I do need to make some progress, and I'm aware that others do want to get in to this debate. I was dealing with manufacturing and the impact on manufacturing, and some of the large manufacturers have told us what the impact will be on them. Ford were clear it would be catastrophic for the UK auto industry and Ford's manufacturing operations in the country. Airbus used similar language, absolutely catastrophic for us. And then Honda, more recently, if we end up with WTO tariffs, we'd have something like 10% of costs in addition on products shipped back into Europe. That impacts on our productivity and competitiveness. This is not exaggeration. These are companies speaking about their businesses, and this will impact on their business, and real people's livelihoods will be at stake. You don't even have to... I'll give way in a moment. You don't even have to take the word only of businesses and the trade unions, though it's a powerful voice. Look at the government benches. The honourable member for Richmond, still, I believe, a business minister in the government, said that no deal, quotes, would be completely disastrous for businesses in this country. No doubt because, like me, he's been talking to those businesses. He then took the novel approach to collective responsibility by saying, I'm very happy to be public about the dangers of no deal and very happy if the Prime Minister decides I'm not the right person to do the business industry job. He, of course, was backed up by the Business Secretary, who said no deal is fully acknowledged, certainly by me and the industry, as being ruinous for our prospects. And the government's own figures show that no deal would mean, over 15 years, between 6.3% and 9% reduction, and every region would be poorer. Wales, 8.1%. I'll give way in just 1 minute. Scotland, 8%, and the north east of England by 10.5%. And anybody who votes tonight to keep no deal on the table needs to explain to their constituents why they're taking that risk with jobs and our economy. I will give way.
Very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I think he has mistaken the honourable member for Richmond with the honourable member for Watford in his grade, and I think quite important to make that correction. But what businesses are saying to me is that their key enemy is uncertainty. And if they don't have certainty over the future terms of trade, then investment decisions will be, continue to be postponed. There is the certainty of those terms of trade on the 29th of March if we leave the European Union on that day, either with the Prime Minister's agreement or moving to World Trade Organization terms.
As for the anxiety of businesses over uncertainty, that is absolutely true. Absolutely true in terms of their yearning for certainty and the impact it's having on their decision-making and on investments. And I think it should be a cause of great concern to all of us. None of the businesses I've spoken to, and I've spoken to thousands in the last 2 years, have suggested to me that the certainty they want is no deal. They all say to me that they do not want no deal, and they normally point out the consequences of no deal. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's indeed making the point that the worst deal is no deal. And in his points about manufacturing, would he also agree with me, and this has been raised with me as well by GMB, Unite and other unions, that the uncertainty over our trade agreements and how we will be trading, those trade agreements that account for about 12% of our imports and exports, the trade agreements that other countries have done with the EU under which we trade, the uncertainty over those is already causing great problems in relation to manufacturing, imports and exports and jobs in our constituencies.
Absolutely. They have real concerns about that, and they raise them regularly. Mr. Speaker, I will give way, but then we'll move on.
My right honourable friend, I have great confidence in him, and he is making a very good speech. But could I say to him, when this all started, my manufacturing sector was saying surely intelligent people across the benches of this House could come to a relative solution. They have now changed. They are now calling me to push here for a second vote, for a people's vote.
Well, I am grateful for that intervention, because it takes me to a point that was repeatedly made by the Secretary of State, which is that it's somehow somebody else's fault that the deal isn't going through. And that the government doesn't bear any responsibility for failing to bring the House with it. I know I want to make this point because it's an important point. The government has failed to bring the House behind its deal. And it cannot get away with simply saying that is somebody else's fault, it's not our responsibility, we've done nothing wrong. No, I want to make this point because it's a really important point. The Prime Minister and the government had a choice 2 years ago. They could have invited this House to express a view on the type of deal this House would accept, and they refused to do so, repeatedly refused to do so. And anybody in government must have been able to foresee the divisions on their own side. They must have been able to foresee that. And in those circumstances, they would have been much wiser to seek the consensus they may look for now 2 years ago, but not having done it, having been blinkered, having red lines that never came down, to now come here and say it's somebody else's fault that they've rejected the very thing they said they would reject for 2 years is not to take responsibility for their own actions. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress. Mr. Speaker, I have been concentrating on the economic issues, but there are wider issues in relation to no deal. Northern Ireland. The Secretary of State spoke about Northern Ireland, and we all know how serious the implications are for Northern Ireland. No deal is a risk to the Good Friday Agreement. The government's own EU exit paper makes that clear. No. I didn't mean that rudely, it's just I do need to make some progress. The EU exit paper from the government earlier this year said WTO terms would not meet the government's commitments to ensure no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That cannot be allowed to happen, and I don't think this Prime Minister would countenance that happening, or the government. Insecurity and counter-terrorism. Mr. Speaker, as honourable members know, intelligence and evidence passes across EU borders in real time every day, and it saves real lives. It requires agreements. That can only happen subject to agreements with the EU 27. That is the basis for passing that information and intelligence. But you also need agreement to decide what use you can put to that evidence and intelligence, and crucially, to plan joint operations. Now, I know that because for 5 years I was in Eurojust as the Director of Public Prosecutions, being part of that exercise. And I know how seriously the Prime Minister takes it because I worked with her when she was Home Secretary, and she knows full well how that saves real lives. No deal puts that at risk, and no responsible government would take that risk. And if they did take that risk, they wouldn't remain in government for long. I will give way.
Given what he said a moment or two ago, which was absolutely right, the government's repeated failure to seek consensus to get us out of this Brexit mess, will he please reaffirm Labour's firm commitment to our policy of supporting a public vote with Remain being an option on the ballot paper? Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I will, because back in 2017, we made it clear that we would respect the outcome of the referendum, and we set out in our manifesto what we would seek to negotiate if we were elected into government. And that was to seek an agreement that would have the benefits of the customs union and the single market. But in that manifesto, we also said that we would reject as a party the government's red lines, that we would rip up the white paper, and we'd reject no deal. We lost that election. But because we lost, we triggered Article 50, notwithstanding how we had voted in the referendum, and we allowed the Prime Minister to start the negotiations. Consistent with our manifesto, we conditionally said what deal we would accept when it came back. We've now got to a hopeless end, and it is a hopeless end. To lose by 230 votes 8 weeks ago, then to lose by 149 votes is a hopeless end. And the government, as I've said, can't just blame others for that. They need to look at themselves and ask why that has happened. But in those circumstances, both of the things that we were ruling out in our manifesto, the red lines of the Prime Minister and no deal, are the only things on the table. And that is why we support a public vote. To protect against those outcomes. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we're doing that at this stage of the exercise, and it's obvious why we need to do so. I'm going to... I will give way.
My right honourable and learned... he is my friend in a legal sense, but most importantly this. We're all grateful who believe in the people's vote for the words that he's given. So if such a motion were to be, or amendment, tabled before this House, would he and his party support now a people's vote and get it going, up and running?
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition 2 weeks ago, Monday, made it clear that we would support an amendment to that end or put one forward for ourselves. Obviously, timing depends on discussions across the House and with others, but that's the clear position that we put down. Mr. Speaker, I do want to press on. No, I'm going to make some progress. I'm aware other people want to come in, and I'm not being rude, but I really do need to move on. I will, for obvious reasons, because...
Thank you. That's very, very, very gracious of the Right Honourable and learned gentleman, and no surprise, very characteristic of him. The Right Honourable and learned gentleman has been a great friend to Northern Ireland. He has mentioned Northern Ireland earlier in his comments, but didn't spend enough time talking about his assessment of the constitutional risk faced by Northern Ireland if, heaven forbid, the United Kingdom were to leave the European Union without a deal. Would the Right Honourable gentleman reflect upon his assessment of that risk?
I'm grateful for the opportunity to do so, because we face the situation of where there is high anxiety in Northern Ireland and across Ireland as a whole, across all communities and different communities, about the prospect of no deal, because the people of Northern Ireland know that the open border is the manifestation of peace, and there's great concern that if anything happens at that border, it will put back the good work that's happened in the last 20 years. That anxiety and this issue is being debated when some of those elected to this House are not here to make the views they might make on behalf of those that they're voted here to represent, and therefore that voice isn't here. I don't say one way or the other what they should do, but it isn't here in this debate. And the executive in Northern Ireland is not functioning. So the constitutional circumstances that prevail in Northern Ireland, for a variety of reasons, and I'm not casting judgment on them, but the circumstances are such that there could hardly be a worse time to be having this discussion, which has turned into a discussion about the very future of the island of Ireland. And that's why I am impatient with those that think that with a drone and a camera you can somehow deal with the issue that is Northern Ireland and Ireland. You cannot. No, I'm going to press on because I'm going to press on. I had left. I'm grateful for that opportunity in relation to Northern Ireland. I want to press on, Mr. Speaker, to the impact on health. No deal would have a huge impact on our health service. It would put real strain on an already overstretched and underfunded NHS, disrupting medical supplies, access to medicines and the ability of hospitals to hire staff. Niall Dixon, who's the Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, said, and I quote, "No deal and no arrangements to protect patients is simply not acceptable and could put lives at risk." Farming, I'm going to make some progress. Farming would also be badly hit. The National Union of Farmers has been clear, I think they set it out this morning, that the proposed tariff regime would be a disaster for UK agriculture, going on to say everything must be done to avoid a no-deal Brexit and the catastrophic impact that this could have on British farming. I'm not quoting voices here of politicians. I'm quoting the voices of those in the field in each of these areas. Finally, on to transport. And as if the Transport Secretary didn't struggle enough already, imagine how he would deal with a no-deal scenario. But it would bring chaos to transport. Hauliers would face hours of delay at new checks would be put in place at borders, and family holidays could be jeopardised by a no-deal Brexit as British travel companies lose their current access and rights. No, I'm going to make some progress. For all those reasons and more, Labour will act tonight and oppose no deal. We support Amendment A, tabled by my right honourable friends from Meriden and Birmingham Erdington, because we believe that is the cleanest and clearest way for the House to express its opposition to no deal. We do recognise that simply opposing no deal isn't the end of the story. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The House needs to have a chance to debate the steps necessary to move forward, and I think there's a growing consensus that that needs to happen. Labour supports a close economic relationship with the EU, and as I've just said, we also support a public vote. Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
Which one?
to the former attorney, and then I'll give it.
Does he agree with me that the difficulty with the government's motion is that it is in fact inaccurate? Because the fact is that the default position is indeed if we don't ratify or if we chose to revoke, which one could do either of our own motion or after a referendum, for example. And that's why he may agree with me, it's raised these suspicions in the House that the motion is slanted. This may be unintentional, but of course it's within the power of the government potentially to remedy that by a manuscript amendment to their own motion before this debate is over.
Well, I'm grateful for the intervention, and I agree with the interpretation. I think it would be helpful to have it amended, because one thing that hasn't helped in this is for the House to make a decision only to find that weeks later the decision that we thought we'd made is then called into question. So I would invite clarity on that so that we can express a clear vote. I will give way, and then I will give way.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. Further to the intervention by my honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, and with a view to try to avoid the no deal that the majority of this House want to avoid, when the government sort of enters into discussions around extension of Article 50, the other side is going to want to seek a purpose. Does he agree with me
that it would be helpful if this House had expressed a view, subject to the Labour Party's public support for a public vote, to that effect in advance of the European Council on March 21st.
Mr. Speaker, if the vote tonight is to reject no deal, and I think it will be, and the vote tomorrow is to seek an extension of Article 50, and I think it will be, but it is only to seek an extension of Article 50, then the question of purpose will be central, will be absolutely central. And that will be a test for the Prime Minister in the first instance, because she will have to make a decision of whether that is the point at which she drops her red lines and her blinkers and opens up the debate to other options. Now, I want to finish this point because it's very important. The Prime Minister needs to decide, if it goes that way to tomorrow, whether she is a Prime Minister willing and able to do that and to embrace other options, or whether she will press on only with her own deal. If she presses on with her own deal, I think we still have to go on and look at other options and get a common purpose. But if the Prime Minister forces us down that road, she's forcing us down the road constitutionally, where the majority will be forcing a view on the executive. And there are constitutional implications for that. So I accept the force of the point that the test will be tomorrow night from that dispatch box, if it gets that far, when we hear from the Prime Minister as to what her then attitude is. If it changes from the attitude for the last 2 years, we might be able to proceed more quickly to find that common purpose. But we do need to find that purpose, and we need to find a majority for it, and it needs to be a sustainable majority, not just for one night or 1 week. It's what we should have done 2 years ago. It's what we should have done 2 years ago. I did say I'd give way, and I will.
I'm grateful to the right honourable learned gentleman. I don't mean to pause him for too long, but my right honourable learned friend did ask a very direct question to my honourable friend who was opening this debate. Specifically, would he agree to revoke Article 50? I thought his answer was quite clear. It's not the government's policy to revoke. The logic of the position of voting, therefore, not to rather to take no deal off the table, at some point, if that is proposed then in the case of the right honourable gentleman's policy, to have a referendum, that he proposes to the other side, the EU, that they would want to delay, and they reject that, either one country or other countries, or the Parliament rejects it. Is it the Labour policy that, in extremis at the end, that they would then want to revoke Article 50 in the sense of the question asked by my right honourable learned friend?
I believe in addressing each problem as it arises, but let me just deal with this question of policy, as if extension is a policy choice of the Labour Party. It's not a policy choice of the Labour Party. It's driven by necessity because of the situation that we found ourselves in. We need to deal with no deal today, and we need to deal with extension tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, no deal should never... No, I'm going to make some progress. No deal should never have been an option. It's the worst possible outcome. Businesses know that. Unions know that. And I suspect most of the Cabinet knows that. It is extraordinary that the government have acceded to a free vote on the matter of such importance today, not to have a position on whether this country should exit the EU without a deal. It is the latest evidence the government is not governing and cannot act in the national interest. I urge colleagues to support Amendment A tonight. We can speak clearly and with one voice that this House will not accept leaving the EU without a deal, and we can bury that so deep that I hope it never resurfaces. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, it's almost 3 years since we had the referendum, and we have reached this quite extraordinary moment. Effectively, we're back to square one. There is absolutely no consensus within the government, within the opposition party, within this Parliament and amongst the public exactly what leave means. And we're having to have a debate today on the question of whether, after 3 years of futility, in 16 days' time, we just give up and leave and see what happens, although I think many of us know and fear the combination of things that are quite likely to happen if you do that. And this is quite bizarre, because it's also still not totally clear, if the House, as I think, votes by a large majority to rule out no deal tonight, quite how we propose to guarantee that we deliver that conclusion. I mean, it sounds as though more attempts are going to be made to reach an agreement, though I voted twice for it, but the government's withdrawal agreement is dead in the water. Any kind of agreement has now got to find some alternative routes. And so in 16 days, we're going to get there somehow, and tomorrow we'll probably vote for an extension. We've got to be clear, extension for how long, extension what for, and the whole thing is dependent on 27 other governments, all of whom are fed up to the back teeth with the state of British politics and trying to negotiate with the British government that can't say what it wants because it can't even agree internally on what it wants. We depend on their approval to avoid this disaster. So as we debate no deal, we have to consider some minor further things. As I give way to...
I'm very grateful to the Father of the House who's co-signed Amendment B with me. And isn't the reality of the situation that the only two choices that are really in the hands of this Parliament are no deal walking over the cliff or revocation, and that luxury only exists for another 16 days, and after the 29th of March that's gone too. The only certain choices are those two choices.
Well, yes, I mean, we've got 16 days left. I've put my name, he and I have both tabled an amendment which faces up to the one thing which I think very few members of the House are facing up to. But in a fortnight, I've discovered that things change very rapidly. 16 days ago, I did not anticipate we'd be in this debate, and anybody who forecasts with confidence what the state of British politics will be in 16 days' time is being a little reckless. But unless somebody has some other alternative, the only way of guaranteeing that absolutely in all circumstances we won't be leaving with no deal is, as our amendment suggested, to revoke. They will have no other method which you can follow. And I won't go back into the legalisms. I've had this discussion with the Attorney-General, who's kindly sent me his opinion, and he's a much superior lawyer to me. But I don't altogether agree with him. I'm a very out-of-date criminal lawyer. But it is true, it's the Advocate General who's expressed doubts about whether it could be said to be acting in good faith if you revoke and then invoke. But I think that's very, very arguable. I personally think we'll be acting in extremely good faith if we made it clear that we were in no state to leave and we would invoke if and when we'd ever decided what we're pursuing. I really should get on because I think I'm not a front-bench spokesman. There are lots of people trying to speak, and I'm very tempted to give way and debate, and I would like to give way and debate, but and knowing myself, I would take too long if I start doing that. So I think, without intruding on tomorrow's debate, we've got to find some sort of agreement as quickly as possible on what it is we are now going to seek and what the delay is for that I think the majority of the House is going to seek. Now, it's very important that we do that, because the background now is that not only is opinion polarised here and lots of factions actually pursuing their own preferred way, but the public are even more polarised than they were at the time of the referendum. They hold this House in near contempt for the confusion that they see, and the sooner we all decide on what the majority here wish to pursue as an alternative to leaving without no deal, the better. I think we need some time, but I've been calling for indicative votes for a very long time. The government's been resisting that and avoiding them. I think it's now the only way we can proceed to explore and demonstrate what there might be a few for. Very briefly, I'm not going to give way. I'm sorry. Just to explain what I would suggest, my guess at something that we could placate the public, satisfy quite a lot of leavers, quite a lot of remainers, which might command majority support across this House. I would put, if I was outside on a less well-informed audience on a public platform, say, why not revert to leaving the political European Union and staying in the common market, which nowadays means the customs union, a single market, and something very much like it. I actually think that quite a lot of the public thought that's what they were voting for when they voted leave. And I think if you put that proposition to the public now, it certainly wouldn't be as polarising as some of the arguments we're having inside and outside this House, having this somewhat dramatic and catastrophic effect on our political dialogue as a nation.
I thank the Father of the House for giving way. The Father of the House is making a case for membership of the customs union and single market while being outside the European Union. Isn't the problem with that approach that in that circumstance we would have no decision-making right at all over trade deals the customs union might do or over single market regulations to which we might be subject?
Well, I'm now being drawn to the merits going outside this debate, actually. I actually think the best deals with other countries are achieved through the EU, which is how British governments have been proceeding for years, and it's a disaster that we are in danger in 16 days' time of falling out of some of the most favourable trade deals that British governments have played a part in negotiating. If you insist on putting that proviso, and if you insist on tackling the problem of our no longer directly being in the regulating-making power, I think we're powerful enough to be given more consultation than those that are outside, say, in the EFTA and EEA arrangements. But you have to just tackle those problems which arise from the fact that you're giving in to the idea that you are leaving the European Union politically and its institutions. I think these problems are grossly exaggerated. I've never heard anybody argue against the EU trade deals we have with other countries. The Japanese one was a tremendous stride forward. It's the biggest free trade agreement in the world, and we're about to fall out of it after about a month. We talk about losing our powers, the threat to our sovereignty that we're not allowed to pass our own different laws on product quality, consumer protection, health and safety, animal welfare, the licensing of products. I've yet to hear a Brexiteer describe a European regulation that we've passed so far that he or she is actually advocating reversing. There are members of the public actually rather demand higher regulatory standards. I get lobbied for more new regulation than I ever do for sweeping away what we have. And if the virtue of no deal is meant to be leaving to have a trade agreement with, say, the United States, and I've been involved in trade negotiations with the United States under President Obama, and I can tell you it is protectionist. They're not dying to open up any of their market to us. They will want us to open up their food market to them. That means not making regulations here. They won't let the House of Commons decide on animal welfare or food standards, nothing to do with us. If we had an agreement, the House of Representatives And the Senate, with the powerful American food lobby, will decide what welfare standards for animals and what the standards of food are. And you won't get a trade deal with the United States unless you agree to that. So I'm being drawn into the merits of the basic argument, but I think we just need to underline that we must look at realistic alternatives to no deal, because no deal wasn't being advocated by anybody when the referendum took place. I don't think no deal was being advocated by more than a handful of people until a month or two ago. No deal has, most Brexiteers were not in favour, even those who campaigned. My right honourable friend is nodding. We're not campaigning for leaving with no trade arrangement with our greatest partner. This is just an accident that has loomed because the House of Commons is not able, and the government is not able, to solve problems in a way we can agree with the other 27, so we're drifting into it, which will be a catastrophe. And I mentioned one finally, I'm going to be very brief, as brief as I can, and I've already taken longer than I intended. The argument is that these things were settled by the referendum. One of the problems is the debate at the time of the referendum doesn't resemble the debates we keep having with ever more frequency in this House. That actually is not because we're out of touch with the real world. It's because the referendum was conducted in the most bizarre, broad-brush terms, with the leading figures on both sides using ridiculous or dishonest arguments in order to make their case, which had nothing whatever to do with the merits or otherwise of being in the European Union. Remainers, I'm afraid, decided, the key ones, David Cameron and George Osborne, decided to raise all these fears, which didn't actually materialise of immediate catastrophe. This is now leading people to say that every future warning that comes from every major business lobby in this country and comes from the Treasury, comes from the government and everybody else, is now to be ignored. That's the classic crying wolf. You know, one day the wolf actually arrives, and you cannot conduct the government of this country on the basis we ignore every expert piece of opinion you have, which most of us actually agree with because we think their warnings are correct. So but the referendum gets invoked in all our other debates. When I ask my constituents who leavers, and most of my constituents, I'm glad to say, voted Remain. But the idea that they were expressing a view on the Irish border and the problems of the Good Friday Agreement when they voted to leave, the idea that most of them actually were expressing any opinion on the single market or the customs union is absolute nonsense. Indeed, when you talk to members of the public now who are all expressing their anger about the state of affairs we're in, I still find people aren't lobbying me about the Irish border and the single market and all the rest of it. We are having to be engaged in this because our duty is governance. Our duty is the medium-longer term, better governance of this country. And we have to address the real world of a globalised economy and today's systems of regulation and the international order in which we have to earn our living against a background of bewildering technological change. I'll conclude briefly, and finally, very much the point, all the arguments about the damage to business, the threat to Ireland, including its constitutional position and so on, have already been addressed by others, and I've agreed with every word that has been said on that. I also just want briefly to give my reaction to that handful of members, I think it is in this House, who seem to think now that no deal is positively desirable. It is an objective that we should have sought from the first. They make it sound very respectable by describing it as WTO rules. And I strongly suspect that many of those who argue this point had scarcely heard of the WTO at the time the referendum was going, and I don't think most of them understand what WTO rules actually comprise. And I won't go into too much detail, not least because I haven't refreshed my own memory too greatly. But There is no developed country in the world which actually seeks to trade in today's globalised economy only on WTO rules. They're a fallback which cover all that international trade which is not governed by recognised free trade agreements. And they're designed to ensure that there is no discrimination between the world amongst those countries which you haven't got an agreement with. That's why they require a schedule of tariffs to be accepted by the WTO, and then those tariffs to be imposed on all those countries with which there's no agreement. That means the EU is obliged by WTO rules, now much loved by Brexiteers, to impose the same tariffs on us that they impose on other third-party countries. And our schedule of tariffs we're obliged to impose on the EU and all other countries with which we don't have a deal. And there are WTO rules that don't allow you to abdicate a thing like the Irish border. You can't say we're not going to put any border posts in. We're going to get organised smuggling become the major industry of the island because we have no idea how we're going to enforce it all. The Republic will be under great pressure, not only for the rest of the EU, but WTO rules would require us to cooperate with policing our border, collecting tariffs, regulatory checks, customs checks, and all the rest. My main worry is actually not entirely with these short-term consequences, catastrophic they would be for some sections of our economy, particularly agriculture, the motor industry, and so on. I think leaving with no deal, the effects in the medium term, the effects in the long term, the effects on the comparative economic strength of this country and whatever happens to the global economy, we will be made poorer than we otherwise would be, and the next generation will be, if we can't move away from this no-deal nonsense. And I hope a big majority settles that tonight. Finally, very finally, I just want to be totally clear what the government's intentions and motives now are. I hope I've been reassured that if we pass this motion tonight, then in all circumstances, the government will take whatever steps that eventually it's necessary to take in 16 days' time to avoid our leaving with no deal. I do not want, in a fortnight's time, the government coming back and saying to the House, it's your fault because you won't vote for the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, and so sadly we're going to have to leave with no deal. We are ruling it out. That really means some indicative votes to give some idea of what the British are going to negotiate over the next 2-3 years. Failing that, it means revoking Article 50. And as someone who's a die-hard European, well, because we don't agree on referendums, we do on practically everything else, as a close political ally and a good friend of mine, I'll give way finally for the last time.
Well, in a spirit of trying to encourage the government to be clear with the House, does he agree with me that the difficulty with the government's motion is that the revocation route is not acknowledged? They may not want it, and of course there are different ways of reaching it, one through a referendum and one by a revocation by this House alone. But the difficulty with the government's motion as tabled is it pretends that route doesn't exist and seems to emphasise a binary choice. Do you therefore agree with me that getting clarity on that and possibly a correction would be immeasurably helpful? Because otherwise it gives the impression the government's trying to pull the wool over our eyes.
I agree with my honourable friend entirely, and I've no idea why the government thought it necessary to put the second half of their motion on the order paper. But I've been reassured, so let me try to reassure my friend. I think that my right honourable friend who opened this debate did give assurance that revocation, he referred to revocation as the alternative several times, and he's nodding in the affirmative. If forced to it, he would revoke. And I take comfort from remembering the Prime Minister occasionally saying, normally to the right-wing nationalist members of my party, that if they weren't careful, the alternative to her deal was no Brexit, which amounts to the same thing. So I'd prefer the wording of the order paper to be perfectly clear, we're ruling out no deal, but I take it that we have been given a guarantee that if no one can think of any better and more sensible way of resolving things, we're going to revoke Article 50 and start all over again, because, as I said when I began, we have got absolutely nowhere at the moment in 3 years of effort after the vote was announced.
Stephen Giffins.
It is always a privilege to follow the member for Rushcliffe, the father of the House. Can I also join the member for Holborn and St Pancras in wishing the Prime Minister a speedy recovery? We entirely understand why she's not here today, and fair play to her coming along and doing Prime Minister's questions and taking time at the dispatch box yesterday as well. It was good to note, of course, that the DEFRA Secretary said so many kind words about the Prime Minister. But then again, the Tories are often kind about those who used to lead them. Mr. Speaker, what a situation to be in, debating a no deal. Next week, we will be 1,000 days on from the EU referendum. Today, we're 993 days on from the EU referendum. And as the member for Rushcliffe rightly pointed out, 16 days away from exit day. Now, Vote Leave backers, and it's a shame the Trade Secretary has left his place at the moment, Vote Leave backers told us that this was going to be the easiest deal in the world. The easiest deal. And we had nothing to worry about. Well, like much else from those who back Leave, these promises were not kept. And it's good the DEFRA Secretary is in his place, because he must take a huge degree of responsibility for the mess that we are in today. Because not only has he had the 1,000 days since the referendum, he's had his entire political life to plan for this. And yet, 16 days out, we're planning for the worst kind of leave, the kind that we were told would never happen, because this would be the easiest deal in the history. And on that point, I'll go away to the member for Totnes.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Can you think of any circumstance under which a consent form would be valid if it was signed 1,000 days beforehand without knowing the exact procedure that you were giving your consent to?
The member for Totnes makes a valuable point, as she often does. Before an election, before a referendum, it is expected that we publish manifestos, white papers, discussion papers, you name it. And that is so those who win a referendum or an election can be held to account for the promises that they made critically before any vote was cast. That is a basic of our democracy. That's a very fundamental of our democracy. And the mess that we are in just now, and Mr. Speaker, it is a mess, shows why Brexiteers like the DEFRA Secretary avoided scrutiny during the EU referendum, and then when we're presented with the cold, hard reality in government, with civil servants who work hard and present the facts, these are denied, often by those who used to be in post, some of his former colleagues. Now, in the very few examples where we have some concrete proposals, promises weren't kept. I'm not just talking about the 350 million quid extra for NHS that was never forthcoming. The DEFRA Secretary himself promised that Scotland would get immigration powers. And we need those powers. We need those powers. Good for our nation, good for the economy. Now, I've raised this on a number of occasions in this House, and my honourable and right honourable friends have raised it as well, as have others. And yet, when we raise it, we are told it is not a matter for the government. He's a senior minister. If we can't hold him to account, who do we hold to account for the promises that were made, the broken promises that were made? Vote Leave. Who do we hold account for that? It's a basic for our democracy, and our democracy has been let down and let down badly. This is a making of his making and his responsibility. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I was late to emojis And I have to say, they've come in handy. I don't know where I'd be today without the unicorn emoji. Any right-thinking politician worth their salt during this debate will have found it extraordinarily handy. It is the must-have accessory for a decent-thinking politician in 2019. And here's a lesson. Politics is about taking responsibility for each and every one of us here. And on that point, as a good example, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. The DEFRA Secretary has told me on at least a couple of occasions from the dispatch box that he believes other European countries will be looking enviously at the United Kingdom's withdrawal agreement. Do you think that might explain why he was so unwilling to take an intervention from me and so many of our colleagues today? Because that surely can no longer be the case.
Well, you see, this is the thing. Just like that promise, every other promise fails to stand up to scrutiny, which is exactly why the DEFRA Secretary would not take any interventions from the SNP benches, because the SNP benches have a clear position. We know what we want. And the DEFRA Secretary should be ashamed of the role, frankly, that has been played in the past by Vote Leave and the promises that have not been kept. Now, he also said that the House has been very good at saying no. Now, let me give him. Given the implications of the vote, and I'm going to remind him of this, and I'm going to remind other members of this in terms of taking responsibility. After the vote, the Scottish Government took the responsible step. They put together a group of experts, because we on this side of the House still think that from time to time it's worth listening to experts. That included diplomats, academics, colleagues from other political parties who have got something to say as well, a former European Court of Justice judge, to look at ways forward. And then they came up with a compromise deal 2.5 years ago. And that was put together by experts, by colleagues from other parties. Did they respond to that compromise deal from these experts? No. Nothing of the sort. It was the most thought-out plan to this mess, and certainly a lot more than we've had so far. No wonder we're in a situation whereby we're talking about a no deal. Just reflect on that for a moment. The disaster economically, socially, in terms of the future opportunities for young people. Yet almost 1,000 days on, we're still discussing and debating a no deal that should have been taken off the table a day after the referendum. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. He's making a very powerful case. Does he agree with me that to deliberately and willingly be prepared to inflict a no deal on the people of this country, in terms of the hardship and the chaos that would cause, is literally really the actions of a rogue state? And it really is quite bewildering that there are still members on the opposite side who seem to think that Brussels is going to be intimidated by the sight of us putting a gun to our own head. That strategy is not an effective one.
As usual, the member for Brighton Pavilion makes an excellent point and has indeed been one of the few sane voices that we have heard throughout this debate in terms of her interventions and the way that she stands up for her constituents and for others in the United Kingdom as well. I noted the other night, about this no-deal situation that we're in, that one of the Conservative MPs, in fact the longest-serving Conservative MP in this House, described the headbanger wing of the Conservative Party. Now, I'm not sure what the name of the other wings are, but I was quite taken with that their own members are talking about a headbanger wing, which clearly must be a sizable proportion of the Conservative Party. And when we're still talking about a no deal, I also note the words reportedly of the Dutch Prime Minister, who has allegedly said a decision to vote for no deal is like the Titanic voting for the iceberg to get out of the way. Now, the Chancellor seems to get this, and today in his spring statement the Chancellor talked about a smooth and orderly transition that would be threatened by no deal. He knows that it would threaten jobs and wages, yet we still debate it and we still haven't ruled it out. Now, I'm not sure which wing the Secretary of State for Scotland belongs to, be it headbanger or some other, but he claimed the other week, and I'm sorry he's not in his place, but he claimed the SNP wanted no deal. Now, Mr Speaker, I don't have the experience of the Secretary of State for Scotland, but let me remind him that the SNP was the first to come out with a compromise, as I've outlined. We're the first to ask for an extension, and last week we even put down a very simple parliamentary motion about ruling out a no deal. Now, I know the Tories try and turn democracy on its head and claim defeat is in fact victory, as we just heard from the DEFRA Secretary, but surely that is even a step too far.
Hear, hear.
We wanted to rule out a no deal, and the Secretary of State could easily have voted for our very simple motion. And let me also remind the Deputy Secretary of this, and I hate to break it to him. Tories lost the last election in Scotland. Again. The SNP won the last election in Scotland. Again. And guess what? Unlike his party, we kept our majority in the seats in which we stood. So if he wants to talk democracy, if he wants to talk winning, he's very welcome to take some lessons from this side of the House. And as far as the negotiating tactic goes, it's as if we're in a situation on no deal, and hearing what the Chancellor said today, that the Prime Minister has shot herself in one foot and then wants us to shoot ourselves in the other foot, just to show everybody how terribly serious we are. And we know that today's trade tariffs will hit our industries, not least the food and drink industry, in which jobs in my constituency and others rely, and for which the DEFRA Secretary has responsibility. Indeed, and the Trade Secretary is back now. The Trade Secretary promised that the UK would, and I quote, replicate the 40 EU free trade agreements that exist before we leave the EU, so we've got no disruption of trade. Now, Secretary of State, how's that going for you? No, going well? No, not going very well, is it? And the problem is, this is not just a political problem for the Conservative Party, as the Treasury bench seems to suggest. This is a problem for our public services. It's a problem for jobs. It's a problem for looking forward to the future. It's not just a Tory civil warrior fighting amongst themselves. It's a problem for us all, and I'll give way to the honourable member on that.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I just take him back a few sentences when he talked about the general election? I don't want to delve into the success of the SNP or whatever, because he actually made a very important point, which is that in the 2017 general election, this government lost its majority. Does he agree with me that on that basis it also lost any mandate for a hard no-deal Brexit?
As usual, and the honourable lady and I hope she doesn't mind, we'll clash every now and again, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying that. And she said the other week that there are times I might regret her sitting there, and she might well be right. But actually she makes a powerful point, a very powerful point, and she made it on the night of the election as well. It's a powerful point. This is a government who lost a majority. This is a government who lost support. And yet this is a government who want to do untold damage. And it's no wonder the DEFRA Secretary is walking away now, who want to do untold damage to jobs and the economy. And he can't even sit here and listen to it. And the Scottish Government have looked into it. The Scottish Government have done their work on it. Actually, do you know what? This will be good. Let's hear it then. If you can defend why you lost your majority and still pursue this nonsense hard deal Brexit.
I didn't lose my majority. Mine went to a record level of 25,725, albeit with no main party opponent, but there you go. Chris Philp.
Well, I had a different point to make, which I'll come to, but actually the Conservative Party's share of the vote went up considerably, and the SNP lost a third of their seats at the last election. Last time we checked. But the point, the more serious point I wanted to raise is this. The honourable gentleman and the Shadow Secretary of State have drawn attention to some of the dangers and risks of a no-deal Brexit. And it's not the government's desire to see a no-deal Brexit. It's not mine either. But by ruling out a no-deal exit entirely, you are by definition either deciding never to leave or to accept terms no matter how bad. Which of those two is the honourable gentleman advocating for?
10 years. No. No. I thought that would be good. No. No. I wish I had my Democracy for Dummies book here. So let me start. In terms of the vote, the SNP won, the Tories lost. OK, in terms of the votes. Let's just nail that straight away. And in terms of no deal, the SNP put down a motion last week that was voted on, and members across this House voted for it, which was to take a no deal off the table in any circumstances. And the member opposite who raised it could have voted for that, did he?
No.
No chance. Absolutely no chance. So he could have done it, and he did not. Now, in terms of a no deal that he talked about, the Scottish Government have had the courage of their convictions to publish their analysis. And what we've seen from that is the devastation that the Chancellor has warned of. The hit would be the equivalent of over £1,500 for every man, woman and child in Scotland, a drop in Scottish exports of up to 20%, a hit in migration and hitting our EU nationals as well, opportunities for young people through lack of freedom of movement and Erasmus gone, and pushing the UK into recession again. And I will give way to the Honourable Lady on that.
I'm grateful for giving way. Given that nearly 50% of the people across the UK voted to stay in the European Union, given that most business, if you ask them, would actually prefer to stay in the European Union, given that the Secretary of State today himself said and evoked the prosperity of this country as member of the European Union, do you not believe it is absolutely unacceptable that staying in the European Union is seen as an unpalatable option?
Staying in the European Union is, and the Honourable Lady makes a good point, is the best deal. The best deal that we have is the one we currently have as a member of the European Union. Now, in terms of public services, this government is spending £4.2 billion on no-deal preparation that we could have taken off the table 1,000 days ago. £4.2 billion, which is not going into hard-pressed public services. £4.2 billion that's going into government mess-ups, ferry contracts that we don't need. Now, in terms of public services, these will be further hit by a no-deal Brexit and overall by Brexit. And let me say this, this will hit the most vulnerable in society. It will hit our public services that have already been dealt a blow by a decade of austerity from parties of every colour in this House. And before I conclude, and because I respect the honourable gentleman, I'll give way one final time to him.
Having said that this should have been taken off the table 1,000 days ago, perhaps he could explain why he put his name to a conclusion of the Foreign Affairs Committee report published 2 years and a day ago, saying that making an equivalent mistake of not preparing for no deal would constitute a serious dereliction of duty by the present administration.
Just how much could we have saved had we taken that off? Because the government hadn't taken the responsibility of taking no deal off the table as they should. And if he wants to refer to that report, that is also the report that said a no deal, yes, would be bad for our European partners, but it would be worse for the United Kingdom, and that's something that he put his name to, and other Brexiteer colleagues from across the House put their names to as well. That they would be prepared to hit the UK economy. They would be prepared for that hit, and he signed up to that very report, and I know it was in that report. It's strange as well that now all we hear is not the benefits of Brexit, but rather we're limited to ministers telling us it won't be that bad. These increasingly poor excuses. I was hearing one the other night, which was that we're in a parliament of Remainers. Now, I'm a Remainer. I'm somebody whose constituency voted to remain, whose nation voted to remain. It does not feel like a parliament of Remainers to me. It certainly does not. And the complaints that those extremists will never be happy. It's about damage limitation. The Brexiteers, including the Trade Secretary and the DEFRA Secretary, have blown it. And I will not vote to make my constituents poorer and less well off because of their mistakes. And let me remind them that it's through the single market that we are wealthier, through its rules in areas like workers' rights and parental rights that we are fairer, through joint action on climate change that we are greener, through work with the Medicines Agency, sadly departed, and the air quality through agreements that we are healthier, and the impact is being felt now. And even yesterday with a report showing that 1.2 trillion eye-watering sums had been relocated from the UK, mainly to areas like Dublin. It is no wonder that similar-sized, independent and sovereign states like Denmark, Ireland and Finland see their futures as part of the European Union. Now, I hope that Mrs Spellman will move her amendment tonight. That is critical. I hope the Right Honourable Member for Meriden will move her amendment tonight. I think that's important. We need to have no deal taken off the table, given the damage to public services, given the damage that it will do to our democracy, given the untold damage. We have two different views. One is of a state being like our neighbours and being joined and pooling our sovereignty and working together as an independent sovereign state. And we have another, which is a UK which is isolationist, which is poorer, which is more remote, and which is going backwards. And nowhere emphasises that more than the fact they haven't taken no deal off the table. So let's push the amendment and take no deal off the table tonight.
Thank you. Order. We have just over an hour and a half and about 35 people wanting to speak. So there will, with immediate effect, I'm afraid, be a 5-minute limit on backbench speeches. Dame Caroline Spelman.
Mr. Speaker, last night I voted in support of the Prime Minister's deal to deliver Brexit. The deal meant that the UK would leave in an orderly fashion, honouring the result of the referendum. The deal was described as good enough by the local businesses, and it would help us move forward. So I was really disappointed that not enough colleagues supported it. Now, I'm no fan of delay, as time costs business money, and this costs jobs. And people really expect better of this Parliament. Many people will be listening to us this afternoon, and I think of those who will hear us trying to rehash the arguments of the referendum or start up the blame game. None of this is helpful. They want us to put the national interest first. We must honour the referendum result, but to do so without a deal in place would be, as the Archbishop of Canterbury said, a moral and political failure. Now, a constituent of mine who lives in Chelmsley Wood, a huge council estate in my constituency, wrote to me yesterday. This is what he said. Tonight I'm in disbelief how 391 MPs have a complete disregard towards the will of the British people and over 17.4 million votes in 2016. I wish you could read this email in Parliament. I have some strong points as a citizen of this country. The public, the 17.4 million, we are nobodies. We don't matter. We're just a tax code number. We don't count. We don't have any rights in our democracy, and our democracy in this country is now proven to be dead. These are his words. There is constant talk of a second referendum, of no Brexit at all. In 2016, I and all my family voted in the referendum. We were promised this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and more importantly, our vote mattered. The UK had the biggest turnout in history, with over 17.4 million giving an instruction to leave the EU. Mrs Spelman, I can tell you this, and I wish you to read this to all MPs. I'm done with voting, as are my family, and in conversation on social media tonight, many of my friends are done with voting too. Now, this constituent has never contacted me before. I don't agree with everything he's said, but my goodness, those words did resonate. I may not agree with him, but I do believe that if this House cannot back a deal that takes us out of the EU, we will be letting millions of ordinary people down. And quite frankly, we don't deserve their votes if we do that. Now, the House knows I don't support the UK leaving without a deal in place. It would be disastrous for the economy, especially in my region. The manufacturing industry employs so many people in the West Midlands, has given so many young people that start of a well-paid, skilled job. And we are already losing jobs in my region, in part through Brexit. But now, more so than ever before, we face the real possibility that we might leave without a deal by accident. And if this comes to pass, we'll all bear some responsibility. The Secretary of State for DEFRA did set out clearly what the consequences are of leaving without a deal, and it was good to hear that from him. The stark reality of this is revealed by the government proposals on temporary tariffs if we leave without a deal. Already the automotive sector are telling me that this regime would thoroughly undermine manufacturing in the UK. The proposed rates are damaging, divisive, and add complexity. Those were in quotes. Of these proposed tariffs, the automotive trade body SMMT said the move doesn't resolve the devastating effect of a no-deal Brexit on the automotive industry. No duty-based measures can come close to compensating for the disruption, the cost and the job losses. Now, this House has demonstrated clearly that there is a majority against leaving without a deal. And the government accepted that and has said it cannot take us out of the EU without a deal without the explicit consent of Parliament. So I'm really pleased that the Prime Minister has brought forward a motion to rule out leaving without a deal on March the 29th. But, Mr. Speaker, I actually do believe that the greater opportunity than that afforded by I cannot give way because the time short, the greater majority afforded by the government motion of obtaining a really large majority in this House against a no-deal Brexit is greater than the opportunity that is afforded by my amendment, which carried on the 29th of March. So I really appreciate the offers of support from other parties, but I will be withdrawing my amendment. We cannot just be against something, Mr. Speaker. We must say what we are in favour of. And I hope that the result of tonight's vote on the government motion will reassure my constituent that we have heard him and we are capable of working together to deliver his hopes for our nation.
I will come to the Right Honourable Lady. Point of order. May I just very gently say to the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Meriden, she can't withdraw her amendment. Her amendment hasn't yet been moved. Her amendment is frankly in the hands of the House of Commons. And if the Right Honourable Lady puts forward an amendment and then chooses not to move it, that's for her judgment and people will make their own assessment of that. But it's perfectly possible for other signatories to it who do stick with the wish to persist with it to do so. Good. Point of order? No. I've treated of the point that was concerning the Right Honourable Lady. I'm very glad to hear it. Good. Mr Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Yesterday the House rejected the Prime Minister's deal for the second time. Today we must reject leaving with no deal, and tomorrow, assuming that we vote that way tonight, we will have to ask the European Union for an extension to Article 50. Now, today is the moment when 2.5 years of repetition of that nonsensical slogan, no deal is better than a bad deal, no deal is better than a bad deal, will finally be defeated in its fight against reality. It was always a slogan, it was never a policy, and that is why the Prime Minister will have to vote against her own slogan when she comes into the division lobby tonight. The argument for rejecting no deal is really very simple. It would inflict the greatest damage on our economy. It is strongly opposed by businesses and trade unions. It would mean a huge step into the unknown, the chaotic and the potentially dangerous. I will give way once.
Perhaps the Right Honourable Gentleman could explain why 5 of his Remainer colleagues serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee signed up to this conclusion 2 years ago. It is possible to envisage scenarios in which no deal might be better than a bad deal, as the government has suggested, such as, for example, if the eventual proposed agreement only involves payment of a large sum to the EU in settlement of UK liabilities, with no provisions for any preferential trade arrangements or transitional arrangements towards a mutually beneficial future relationship.
All I can say to the honourable gentleman is that I can't speak for those colleagues. My view has consistently been clear that no deal cannot be a policy for this country. And by the way, it's not what those who campaigned for leave in the referendum ever argued for. So I don't quite understand why someone should now be arguing for no deal when they didn't argue for it in the referendum itself. Now, no one who's spoken, not intervened, but no one who's spoken thus far has stood up and argued why no deal would be a good idea. It's not really surprising why they haven't. We've heard from Carolyn Fairbairn, who this morning, responding to the schedules that's been published, said, "This tells us everything that is wrong with a no-deal scenario. This is no way to run a country." The Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders said no deal would be catastrophic for the auto industry, ending frictionless trade, add billions to the cost of manufacturing and cost jobs. And we know why, because we know, I'm not going to give way because of time is so short, because we know that the lorries that keep those car factories going every single day, if there is any disruption, then it will affect the production line. And the car industry has had enough bad news in the last 2 months without it being added to by people standing up and saying no deal's a jolly good idea. And this from a professor at one of our major institutions of higher education, who I happened to bump into on the Underground this morning, said to me that no deal would be catastrophic for the institution, its research funding and its ability to recruit staff. And the truth is, these are conversations that can be and are repeated in thousands of workplaces up and down the country in thousands of sectors of the economy. And it's why the Brexit Select Committee, Mr. Speaker, in its 12th report said quite explicitly, leaving with no deal cannot be the policy of any responsible government. Now, if members want to read the argument, they can go and look at that report. I would, however, just draw attention to the problem faced by the company that makes signs and exports them to Europe to be fitted by their workers, who asked me what will happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and I referred to that in a previous speech. Well, since then, I asked a written question, and I got the following answer. UK nationals travelling to the EU for the purposes of work may be subject to extra conditions. Businesses will need to check individual member state immigration rules for whether there are any requirements or conditions around supporting documentation, work permits or visas. Businesses should also check whether there are any restrictions on the provisions of services, such as whether a UK professional qualification is recognised in the country in question. Now, what use is that reply to a business that's worked hard to create jobs, which is trying to run a business, but has no idea what those in this House who will stand up today and argue that that business's future should be thrown into that? What use is an answer like that? It basically says you're on your own. And the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is this: that given what happened yesterday, today's vote is indeed the next step required before tomorrow's inevitable decision to apply for an extension to Article 50, which the Brexit Select Committee, with, I must say, commendable speed in the report it published this morning after the events of last night, says will be necessary. And I want to say to the government, given the, if I may put it like this, rather unhelpful coda to the government's motion tonight, I think the House will vote to reject a no-deal Brexit on the 29th of March this evening, but ministers need to recognise and be aware and acknowledge that this House will, in my view, never vote to leave the European Union without a deal, whether it's the end of March, the end of June, the end of October, because we are not prepared to take this risk with our economy, our jobs and the livelihoods of the people we represent, not today and not ever.
Green. Speaker, I rise to move the Amendment F in my name and that of an eclectic and wide-ranging group of right honourable and honourable friends from three separate parties. Many of us have perhaps not found ourselves signing amendments together much in the past. So I should explain the purpose of the amendment is manifold, but one of the purposes is to avoid what may face us at the end of this month, a cliff-edge no-deal Brexit for which it's clear the country as a whole, and in particular many of our major industries, are not prepared, as the Right Honourable Gentleman from Leeds Central has just repeated. I'm conscious that some who will support this amendment are sanguine about an immediate no-deal Brexit, so I should set out my own position, which is that I think that no deal on March the 29th would be a disaster for the economy of the country. It would be a particular threat to manufacturing industry, and as it happens, in practical terms, it would be a particular threat to the day-to-day life of my constituents and everyone else in East Kent, which is why I oppose it. I will give way to my honourable friend.
Thank him for giving way, and I have the utmost respect for the right honourable gentleman. I will be opposing his amendment this evening. Isn't it somewhat strange that the very people who voted last night to kill Brexit for March the 29th this year are now signed up and will vote this evening to delay Brexit? And this will only be the first delay, of course, because there will potentially be others in the future. We're in a very strange place at the moment.
Well, I think the one point of that intervention I agree with is that we are in a very strange place at the moment. I think the whole House can agree with that. I'm as keen. I will allow one more intervention, the Honourable Lady.
Thank you. I'm most grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for allowing me to intervene upon him. I would just like the Right Honourable Gentleman to explain in some detail whether or not the proposals that he's asking the House to vote on tonight, protect the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in all its parts, and in particular the consent principle, which is guaranteed in the withdrawal deal and the Prime Minister's Brexit deal on page 307.
It's an extremely valid point. I believe they do. I will come on to the what's actually in the amendment shortly in my speech, if I may. But as I hope I've made clear, I'm as keen as anyone to reject an immediate no deal. I will support the government's motion this evening, and indeed this amendment is deliberately designed not to replace the government's motion, as many amendments do, but actually to act in addition to it. But we should not deceive ourselves. This House should not deceive itself. Voting against no deal does not mean that a deal will magically emerge. This House has to agree a deal, and that deal needs to be acceptable to the EU. We can pass motions ruling out no deal until we're blue in the face, but it will make no difference unless there are options that this House will support. And I think that's a piece of realism that the House hasn't yet fully addressed. So I voted for the deal last night and indeed in January, and I'm happy to assure the government that I will do so again if they wish to try one more time. And more broadly, I campaigned for Remain, but I respect the result of the referendum, and I therefore draw the conclusion that I should vote for a deal that delivers Brexit. And my principal aim in all of this, and for those of us who support this particular amendment, is to make sure that Brexit is as smooth as possible for the citizens and businesses of this country. And this seems to me to be an honourable aim, whatever view you took during the referendum. It's a view you can hold if you believe that Brexit is the best opportunity Britain has had for generations, or if you believe that it's a mistake whose damage has to be mitigated. From both those viewpoints, you can arrive at the same practical conclusion. And that practical conclusion is what lies behind Amendment F. It has 4 separate parts, and I was grateful that the Prime Minister accepted at least 2 of them in full earlier today at Prime Minister's questions. The first one she accepted, and indeed the government has already implemented, is the publication of the tariff schedules that we will need. I make no comment on the merits of them, particularly of the individual merits of each of the schedules. Those are clearly a matter for legitimate debate. But I think the need for information as early as possible is absolutely paramount, and I'm glad that the government has already taken that step, which is urged in the amendment. Secondly, unilaterally guaranteeing the rights of EU citizens resident here. This has been, I know, a desire of members from all sides of this House for the period since the referendum, and again, I'm glad that the government is on board with that. The third key element of the amendment is that the government should seek an extension of Article 50 until May 22nd, the latest date we could have to avoid the prospect of European elections, which I think the prospect of which brings out the Brenda from Bristol in all of us. So I think that would be a useful delay, and again would give business more time to prepare for the new tariff regime. The fourth, and the largest part of the proposal, is to offer both money and standstill proposals in a range of areas to the EU in return for a period between now and December 2021 in which we could negotiate the new future relationship. In other words, this provides a gentle glide path to that new relationship instead of the cliff edge that might otherwise threaten us. The future relationship is, of course, much more important even than the withdrawal agreement, which this House keeps turning down. It will decide our future prosperity and security. So this amendment focuses on that long-term goal, given the obvious difficulties of the short-term goal of the withdrawal agreement. I know the objections. I've heard them, that Monsieur Barnier won't have it. He's already said that he won't have it. It seems to me that if we don't proceed on a path just because Michel Barnier has said he won't have it, then we would never get anywhere in these negotiations. And secondly, that this is a managed no deal. As I say, I would much prefer a deal, but if we can't sign one, it's better to have a plan B that avoids chaos, that gives us years to craft a proper trade deal as part of a future relationship. So I urge colleagues on all sides, whatever their views on wider European issues, to look favourably on this amendment. We live in a free vote world these days, so if necessary, ignore your whips. You can be nice to them tomorrow. We need ways out of this impasse. This is one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've only got 2 weeks to go now, and businesses do not know whether they need to pay tariffs, whether public services are going to face shortages, or families don't know whether their food bills are about to go up. Nobody can plan. As the British Retail Consortium said today, there are ships already on their way to our great trading nation who do not know what kind of customs paperwork they are going to face by the time they arrive on our shores. Police officers who are midway through important investigations to stop serious criminals and organised gangs operating across borders, who have no idea whether the European arrest warrants that they have out on those criminals are about to be ripped up and they've got to start again. Border officials who rely on European criminal databases to check within the flick of a passport to screen for sex offenders or child traffickers or organised criminals don't know whether those databases are going to be denied to them. For manufacturing industry, that we should be standing up for British manufacturing, making sure it's got a level playing field to compete in the world, and instead, no deal would be a hammer blow to the heart of our manufacturing base. In my constituency, we have manufacturers like Haribo, who depend on ingredients from abroad and don't know what delays they're going to face. Burberry, who don't know whether or not their goods are going to face tariffs if they trade as a result of no deal. And for small businesses in particular, are we really going to say to small businesses who depend on imports that their livelihoods could be at stake because this House is prepared to accept no deal in just 2 weeks' time? Think of the florist who gets up early in the morning before any of us are even up to collect the delivery, who does not know whether their supplies are going to be able to get their supplies and does not know whether they are going to be able to trade or not. And that's why we have a responsibility to say we will not just accept no deal on the 29th of March. The government has tried repeatedly to get its deal through and it has failed. So we now have to face up to what the default position should now be. And the Environment Secretary said very clearly to me, in his answer to me, that if we don't have a deal in place, the vote tonight will mean that the default position is no longer leaving the European Union with no deal on March the 29th. And I would really appreciate it if the Trade Secretary could confirm that when he speaks tonight, because there have been different sort of confused interpretations, and it is really important to be clear. The reason that we asked for these debates, the reason that we sought them, was to be clear that we have a responsibility now, 2 weeks before the Brexit day, we have a responsibility to be clear what the default position is. The government has maintained for all this time that the default position is no deal. Well, that's not on anymore. We have to now decide tonight, to vote tonight, to change the default position, to say we will no longer have a default position as no deal because it is too irresponsible. And tomorrow we will take the decisions on the way forward.
My friend giving way. Just for clarification, for the benefit of many of us in this House who want to support the amendment with your name as a lead name on there, will you be pushing it to a vote this evening?
I did listen to the honourable member, and I have to say that I still support that amendment. I think it's the right amendment. I think we should hear the views of the House and hear the view of the Trade Secretary, but my personal view is if that amendment is pushed to a vote, then I will certainly be voting for it. So I think the Trade Secretary does need to make this clear, because I think that we don't want any fudging about this. It's really important. We are today ruling out no deal on March the 29th. 29th. That has to be the purpose of our vote and the support from it from all sides of this House for this. Mr. Speaker, we will then need to move to the issue of what happens tomorrow and the extension of Article 50. And that has to be an extension for a purpose. It cannot simply be for more of the same, Prime Minister going back to Brussels and saying the same things about changing the backstop and the same discussions that we've already been many times before. We cannot just have the same meaningful vote on the same things when it's been rejected. So it has to be for something different. I would say to the government, I think they should now put forward a timetable and a process to actually make some proper decisions on what the future partnership would look like, because we still have no idea whether this is going to be Norway or Canada or nearly Norway or close to Canada. We have no idea, and the government has never come forward to have proper debates on that, proper clarification. There are two big failings underlying what the government has done. They've never sought consensus. The Prime Minister has never sought consensus and never sought to build agreement, nor has she ever sought clarity. So she has deliberately sought a political declaration which simply fudges the future and never gives us clarity. We need clarity and we need consensus, and that is why we should have a series of indicative votes. The government should itself put forward its own negotiating mandate for the future partnership and for the future relationship that we can then again have votes on and can have amend, and actually give this House the chance to make some decisions about how we get clarity on the way forward and also how we get consensus on the way forward as well. But whatever our different views about what the right position should be, I hope that this whole House can come together to rule out no deal, because the government's basic responsibility is to keep this country safe, to make sure people can afford their food bills, to make sure the sick can get their medicines. All of those are put at risk at no deal. We should reject it tonight.
Order. On account of the level of interest in the debate, my desire to accommodate it as best I can, the time limit on backbench speeches will have to be reduced to 4 minutes with immediate effect. George Eustace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I resigned from the government 2 weeks ago over the issues that we'll be debating in the days ahead. And since Parliament has now taken direct control of events and decisions in this negotiation, I wanted to be free to participate in that debate and to make the case publicly on these benches that I've made privately within the government over the past year. And I fear that Parliament has sent us on a dangerous course. We are in real danger today of signalling to the European Union and others that we are too scared to leave without a deal, and then tomorrow ordering the Prime Minister to go on her hands and knees, cap in hand to Brussels, no, I won't give way, cap in hand to the European Union to beg for an extension to Article 50, and we don't know what counter-offer they may make. They may demand that that extension must be 2 years. They may demand a large financial charge for that extension. They may even say they won't give an extension, but it's open to us to revoke. And members in this House may face a very difficult, very uncomfortable decision in just a couple of weeks' time. So I believe that we must be willing, if necessary, to take our freedom first and talk afterwards. We already know that the European Union, and I worked up close with a lot of the preparations for no deal, they are already seeking to effectively have an informal 9-month understanding. And there have been a number of points over the last 2 years where the government could have reappraised its approach to these negotiations. For me personally, a year ago, at the point at which the implementation period was agreed, it was clear that our negotiations were getting into a little bit of trouble, and that we were in danger of drifting along a path of least resistance, only to find that we had an agreement that Parliament would not accept. And about that time, something else interesting happened. I will give it.
Thank you. I'm extremely grateful. I'm sincerely extremely grateful. Can I just check that, in fact, the right honourable gentleman has made a point of speaking to the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who has warned consistently about the dangers of no deal and a hard Brexit and a hard border on the island of Ireland.
I've not spoken to Chief Constable, but I've been involved in lots of other negotiations on the DEFRA front. But on the 22nd of March last year, when I was visiting Oslo for some fisheries negotiations, our then ambassador to Norway told me that she had had a busy week because she had been placed on standby by the Foreign Office to deliver a letter by hand to the Norwegian government, giving 12 months' notice of our intention to quit the EEA. And in the end, because of the transition agreement, she was stood down, and this country took a conscious decision not to give notice to quit the EEA. And this made me curious, since up until that point, and indeed since, the government has always maintained that when we leave the EU, our agreement under the EEA automatically falls away. And if that were true, and if that were the only possible interpretation of the EEA treaty, why was our ambassador armed with a letter to deliver to the Norwegian government? And after much probing, what I established is that there is indeed more than one interpretation that you could adopt, and the Foreign Office were concerned that in the absence of giving that notice, we would be subject to challenge under the Vienna Convention. And that opened for me a prospect of a different way to approach this, of relying on our existing EEA membership, asserting our rights under that treaty, and simply applying to join the EFTA pillar of the EEA agreement. It's an arrangement that means we would have had no customs union, control of our fisheries and agriculture policy, an independent trade policy, no need for an implementation period, no need for a backstop, no need to worry about whether we have a codicil or a protocol, since we would be able to quit at any time with 12 months' notice in writing. Now, I have tremendous respect for my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, and was initially very encouraged when he picked up and ran with this idea. However, as honourable members who know him will know, he also has a tendency to overcomplicate things. So a simple, clean EEA model that could have given us an easy pathway out of this became Norway Plus, then the Customs Union 2.0, and then a backstop added as well. And the result of that is it's alienated many people on this side of the House who might otherwise support it. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, my view on this is that we need to unhitch the customs union and the backstop from any proposal based around our existing EEA membership. That may require us to be ready to leave without an agreement. Secondly, we can dynamically align our regulations over the next 9 months. And finally, we can have that dynamic alignment as a bridge to a new arrangement where we apply to join the EFTA pillar.
Thank you. Vera Hobhouse.
As we are dangerously moving closer to Brexit Day, but with no deal yet agreed, it is finally time to bust the myth of the will of the people. Opinion polls tell us that there is now a majority in the country for staying in the EU. However, the Prime Minister and her government insist on Brexit because it is the will of the people. I recently asked the Prime Minister how many of the 17.4 million people who voted leave in 2016 voted for her deal, and how many voted for no deal. She couldn't answer that question. Yesterday, only 242 members voted for her deal. Today, a different and probably rather smaller number will vote to leave the European Union without a deal. According to the Prime Minister's use of language, both are delivering the will of the people. However, within the Brexit camp, people cannot agree what the will of the people is. The alarming thing is that members on the Conservative benches have given up the argument that leaving the EU is good for the country. The only reason they put forward is that we have to respect the will of the people. Shouldn't that mean that they have to vote for every Brexit? But they don't. And the reason for that is they're reading into the referendum result their own opinion about Brexit, which has nothing to do with the will of the people. The will of the people is a fig leaf for members in this House to pursue their own Brexit agenda. We need to see this mantra of the will of the people for what it is, a false argument. It's a fake. There's now a majority in the country for staying in the EU, and I'm on their side, along with my Liberal Democrat colleagues, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Green Party, and the Independent Group. On these benches, we are united in our view that our future is in the European Union. We stand for peace, collaboration, solving problems together, for example, tackling the big issue of climate change. Although we represent at least 50% of the people of this country, our side of the argument has been completely sidelined in the last 2.5 years. It is now time that Parliament seriously considers the possibility of staying in the European Union. In January, the Prime Minister's deal was voted down by 230 votes. Yesterday, almost the same deal was voted down by 149 votes. At least 40 members in this House have changed their mind within 2 months. Not because the deal has essentially changed, but because it was clarified, amplified, explained in more detail. The 2016 referendum is now over 2.5 years ago. Many things about the EU and our membership have been clarified, amplified, explained. The People's Vote Coalition on these benches understand that in a democracy, people can change their mind and have a right to do so, just like MPs in this House. On the false pretense that it is the will of the people, let the Conservative Party opposite stand for Brexit. Let the Labour Party stand for Brexit. But here on these benches, we are standing for the UK being a member of the European Union and the right of the people in this country to have a final say and change their mind if they so wish. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Duncan Smith.
Speaker, clearly it's short time, so I'm not planning to take any invention. This is something really important that I've said, which somebody wants to object to. But can I just start by saying to my honourable friend, the member for Campbell and Redruth, how much I appreciated his time in the service that he gave, and I think it's a great pity that he's no longer there for reasons that is very clear. Can I quickly say to my right honourable friend on the front bench that I clearly can't be supporting the idea of taking no deal off the table, because I've always believed that it ultimately isn't up to us to take it off the table, other than, as my right honourable learned friend said, if we are prepared somehow to revoke. If we're not prepared to revoke, then we put ourselves in the hands of the EU. They may decide that they don't want us to extend, and therefore where does that leave us? That leaves us with having to leave without the withdrawal agreement. And after all, I say that the idea of no deal is a bit of a misnomer, because in actual fact there are a whole series of things that are taking place right now in the EU and even here which amount to deals, arrangements and agreements. I'm not going to go through the list of them. We have a very, very short period of time. So I simply say to my honourable friend, I wasn't planning to give way because others want to speak. Well, OK, I'll give way to my friend, but very briefly.
I received a message during the course of the debate from David Campbell-Bannerman MEP, and he said that today in the Strasbourg European Parliament, they voted through no-deal measures on social security, road freight connectivity, basic air connectivity, the fishing fund, fishing vessels authorisation, railway safety and connectivity, then road haulage cabotage, the right to operate within certain territory for UK hauliers, and on it goes. Isn't it the case that the Malthouse Compromise, Plan B, is emerging through the fact that both sides are taking sensible contingencies in their mutual interests?
This is really, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for that, and I agree completely. And that's my point, really, about the concept of no deal versus managed exit, and that's the way that I would refer to this process. Either we do it by a completely upfront withdrawal agreement, or we do it by a whole series of agreements, but my point is it's about managing that process of leaving. And I simply say this is why I lent my name to my honourable friend's amendment that he moved, and I agree fully it's not perfect. I don't maintain that at all, but what it does seek to do is try and find a way that those of completely different views on this can come together to recognise that the people voted to leave, and our job is to deliver that, but is there a way to deliver it if somehow there isn't the chance of an agreement? I say also to my right honourable friend, I'm not going to give way, honestly, if you forgive me, because I'm sure it's the same question as before. The answer is I haven't spoken to the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland, but I do take very serious consideration of that. Can I just say to my right honourable friends that I don't think that their deal is dead. I think that the thing that made it almost impossible for some of us to vote for it was the Attorney's paragraph 19 that seemed to contradict the Deputy Prime Minister's comments on the night before. And that is why the Malthouse Compromise has gone forward, because it says both making the deal and in the event of not being able to make the deal, it has both categories in it that allow us to reach an agreement. And the key to this is to find a way to replace the backstop as it exists at the moment with alternative arrangements which are listed very heavily here. And there are a whole series, a number of them. I won't go through them now. And so the points my right honourable friend made are quite correct. that we've asked essentially for 4 elements in this. Behind them lie a great deal more detail, but that has already been discussed over a series of meetings with my right honourable friends on the Treasury bench. And the point I would make is that we reached what I thought was a pretty good agreement, and I do give credit to the Prime Minister and others for having bound in those alternative arrangements, albeit not absolutely, but they made a big sort of progress in the deal that she laid on the table. And that will help enormously, because if we replace the backstop with those Malthouse alternatives, then what we do is get rid of the risk of the backstop as being an imprisonment or an entrapment, because they become customs arrangements which allow all sides, including Dover and Calais, to trade quite successfully without too many problems. And that's really the point. Now, I know some my colleagues are concerned, quite rightly. I'm not in favour of just extending for the sake of it. I think that will anyway be rejected by the European Union or by whatever country, because there needs to be a purpose. The point of the extension here is only to meet the practicalities of getting the arrangements into place ready for that process of managed withdrawal without a withdrawal agreement. I wouldn't otherwise vote for an extension with no purpose, because I think all you do is kick the can down the road, as the Prime Minister has said, ending up with exactly the same decisions to be taken, but only a few months later. And the point I recommend of the Malthouse process is it allows us to manage that process carefully with practical solutions, as my right honourable friend laid out, and that allows us that period of time that will allow us to create that. So I recommend to my right honourable friends and to those on the other side that if we come together and vote for this, we offer 2 things. The first is the opportunity to get an arrangement that allows us to leave even with a withdrawal agreement, and on the other hand, in the event of not having such an agreement, we manage that process of leaving that takes away that fear of having no deal.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first time I'm speaking in any of the Brexit debates, although I have a way of making my opinion well known to the public elsewhere. I'm really, really sick of the way that the government has gone about this and is now basically saying it's my way or the highway. And the highway is rocky and bad, and they're asking all of us in this House to walk down a road that has no surface and we can't see the end of it. And they expect that sort of a coverall, like we care about the national interest because we've got this really bad plan and you're not walking down it, as if we don't all care about the national interest. You know, the people on those benches over there don't own the national interest. It's not the same as nationalism. It is something that we all care about very, very deeply. And I don't know how the member for Surrey Heath, the Right Honourable member for Surrey Heath, could stand in front of us today and tell us about how our food prices were going to go up and how it would be awful for agriculture and for all of the things that he said, and then not move every fibre in his being to end that. If I was in his position, and the whole let's not be talking about revoking, as the honourable member just talked, well, let's be serious. If any of us cared more about our elections, in fact cared less about our elections and more about the national interest, we'd be having a really deeply serious conversation about making this stop and starting to talk about the things that the people where I live talk about. Because do you know what? In this whole will of the people that others have touched on, we're terrified of the people in this country, in this House. Why are we so terrified of them? This 17.4 million, they all think this because I think this, and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to lay over my own opinions onto 17.4 million people that everybody in this building does. We've got nothing to be scared of, because actually we have a responsibility to inspire those people out there and to lead them somewhere. And the single thing that has been missing from the very beginning of this horrid and torrid affair in British politics was any semblance of leadership and courage to take the country somewhere with them. The reason that people voted leave are plentiful, and I'm not going to pretend that they all agree exactly with me, but if we no deal, the people who voted leave in my area, who I am not scared of, and if they don't like the things that I say, do you know what? I believe in parliamentary democracy and they can get rid of me. And I am not frightened of that prospect. I wish the Prime Minister had not been made to be frightened of the people who sat behind her. She's certainly terrified of the people in the country. What the people will face where I live in the event of no deal, what they will face is still the same levels of poverty, still the same unstable job market. They will face much, much worse. They will not be able to afford food, which they can precious little afford now, and they will look up and say, I thought that there was going to be a golden era, and then they will be angry. That is what people in here should be scared of. We should not be scared of the country. I will absolutely give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and she's making a very powerful speech. May I just say one thing about what she said about the Prime Minister? It is my view, and I have studied it carefully, like the honourable lady, my honourable friend, has. It is my view that the Prime Minister is respectful of those people, not frightened of them.
I agree. I am actually, he knows the Prime Minister considerably better than me. Perhaps if the Prime Minister had ever tried to talk to me about any of this, or people who live in seats like where I live, we could have had a much better conversation in here. I don't know her. To me, she looks like a rabbit in the headlights. She looks like somebody who isn't actually willing to say the real facts and say, this is really bad for the country. So we hear it in briefings, in bars, in Brussels, instead of hearing it directly from a woman who should genuinely feel the courage to say, do you know, I'm terrified of all the things that were outlined by the member for Castleford and Pontefract. She should say, I'm terrified of the security implications. I am terrified for the food price implications. I'm terrified for the trade implications. And do you know what? You might not like it, and I might lose my role as the Prime Minister, but I'm going to do what is best for you, because that is what courage and leadership is. And whilst I respect deeply the people where I live, I noticed how selective the ERG are about caring about their needs. They want them when they back up their idea of Northern Town Leave voters. They don't want them so much when they need to give them welfare.
Speaker, 17.4 million people voted to leave. They were told, both by the government and the Remain campaign, that that meant leaving the customs union and the single market. They were told that many things would be damaging or wrong if we left. There were a series of very bad short-term forecasts for the first year after the vote. The public said to the experts, we don't believe you. And the public were right about the short-term forecasts, and we saw jobs up, not down. We saw growth up, no recession. We saw house prices performing reasonably well. And this was a specific forecast for the year after we had had the vote, before we could conceivably have left. I give way.
Interventions from now on are perfectly legitimate, but if members intervene, they will be stopping others speaking. As long as they know that. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for giving way. Can the Minister, can the honourable gentleman explain to me how anyone can trust this government when we were told for a very long time it was the Prime Minister's deal or no deal, when that is clearly not the case? Because this House, if it chooses to do so, can revoke Article...
I don't agree, Mr. Speaker. I think that is exactly where we are, that we either leave with the withdrawal agreement or we leave without the withdrawal agreement. And that is what this House voted for when it voted to send the Article 50 letter. And that is what this House voted for when it enacted the EU Withdrawal Act. And I am not here to recreate the arguments of the referendum. The public are heartily sick of this Parliament going over and over and over the same arguments that we've had for 3 or 4 years now in the run-up to the referendum, and subsequently they expect us to be purposeful, serious and sensible, and to sort out the issues and the problems arising from the decision to leave the European Union. And that is exactly what we should be doing. And I come here in that spirit. I understand Remain voters have real concerns. I think some of them are exaggerated.
and it's up to us, working with the government, to show that all of them can be managed and that there are many upsides which we are looking forward to, which Leave voters clearly had in their mind. And I'd like to reassure the House that calling certain views, certain names, is not helpful to a grown-up debate. This is not a no-deal exit we're talking about. This is a many-deals exit. As we've just been hearing from my honourable friend, a whole series of measures have been enacted recently in the European Parliament to show that both sides of the Channel there is serious work to make sure that lorries can move, planes can fly, goods will move across borders, there will be an understanding about what happens on customs and other checks, that the drugs will come in, the food will come in. And I think it is quite wrong of people to scaremonger and frighten people by pretending that none of this work has taken place, or pretending that German pharmaceutical companies will refuse to send their goods anymore, or that the workers at Dover will get in the way and block them coming in. It isn't going to happen. We've heard very good news from Calais and Dover about all the work that's gone on at both ports to make things work. So let's come together and be practical and understand that certainly all Conservative and Labour MPs were elected to this 2017 Parliament to get Brexit through. And we all stood on national manifestos that said we would do that. And the public cannot believe it, that so many, particularly Labour MPs, are now saying, we didn't really mean it, we don't care about that, we want to stop it, we want to delay it, we want to redefine it in a way where it is no longer Brexit. Brexit means taking control of our own money and then being able to spend it on our priorities. And the sooner we do that, the sooner we will have that boost to our economy which taking that measure would bring about. It means having tariffs that make sense for British industry and for importers who might like tariffs taken off things. And I'm very glad my right honourable friend has slashed tariffs off a whole load of imports where it's not goods that we compete actively with in the United Kingdom, because that will be better news for all those consumers who won't have to pay those tariffs anymore once we have our own tariff schedule. But my big idea for the government, because I quite understand that a very large number of people in this Parliament want a bigger deal or more deals than are currently on the table, my idea is that the government, even at this late stage, should offer to the European Union a comprehensive free trade agreement based on the best of EU Canada, EU Japan, maybe with more services, because we already have alignment with services. And if the EU, as I suspect they would agree just to talk about that, then we can leave on the 29th of March without having to impose any new tariffs or non-tariff barriers on each other and proceed under GATT 24 to negotiate a free trade agreement. That, I would have thought, would unite a lot of moderate Remain voters with most Leave voters. I strongly recommend it to the government. This Parliament must allow us to leave on the 29th of March, otherwise it will be the people against the Parliament.
Howell Williams.
I think I've only heard one honourable member that's that profoundly silly slogan, no deal, no problem. Though I did notice some rather prosperous-looking people outside the palace this afternoon brandishing posters to that effect. For the rest of us, even the most sanguine adherents of no deal concede that there would be some economic pain. In the short term, they say, well, for me, no pain for the comfortably set up. It is the squeezed majority who would feel the pain, and for my part, no deal would be particularly damaging for Wales. My party will be voting tonight to take no deal off the table, and permanently so would be the best in our opinion. I refer honourable members to my Amendment C in my name and the name of my honourable friends, which would seek to extend Article 50 and also hold a referendum. Now, I just want to refer very briefly to some of the problems that we foresee for my country if we follow the no-deal course. It would, of course, endanger public services and it would put people's health at risk. As to our economy in Wales, according to the Welsh Government analysis, a no-deal Brexit would wipe £5 billion off the Welsh economy, meaning fewer jobs and lower wages. 60% of Wales's exports goes to the European Union, and in that respect, I think we stand out amongst the countries of these islands in that we do have an exporting economy. As far as public services are concerned, with the economy in decline, under no deal, public services would certainly be endangered in Wales. In Wales, the number of EEA nationals in the social care workforce has grown by over 50% since 2011. Now, without a deal, I think EU citizens' right to work here will be in question at best, and putting further unwarranted pressure on the NHS and the social care sector. In terms of health, people in the UK rely heavily on medicines imported from the European Union. 99% of the insulin used in the UK, for instance, is imported largely from the European Union. And the BMA have estimated that no deal could lead to delays of between 12 and 24 months in life-saving drugs. One particular concern which I've raised in the House previously, indeed last week, is the effect on agriculture. I would like to quote the NFU Cymru President John Davies. This afternoon he said there can be no doubt that a no-deal Brexit would be incredibly damaging to the Welsh agricultural sector, and that eventuality should be avoided at all costs. And in that respect, he agrees entirely, I think, with Glyn Roberts, who is the president of the Farmers' Union of Wales. We have two farming unions in Wales here. They agree. All I would want to say lastly, Mr. Speaker, is that our Secretary of State, the Secretary of State of Wales, makes great store by saying that he is the voice of Westminster, of Wales in Westminster. And I think he has the opportunity tonight, given that we apparently have a free vote, he has the opportunity to stop playing games and come out strongly against the calamity of a no deal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't agree with my right honourable friend, the member for Wokingham, that a no-deal Brexit is in some way something which is eminently livable with. It plainly isn't. Looking at my own constituency, talking to the pharmaceutical companies that are there, looking at the cost which has already been incurred by them in order to try to face up to the prospect of no deal and the risks that they run if no deal goes ahead, it seems plain to me that no deal would be very damaging to this country indeed. Damaging in the short term because of the chaos that will accompany it, damaging in the medium to long term because I believe we will be seriously economically disadvantaged by it. And I find it genuinely very troubling that as we come closer to the crunch, so there seem to be more and more people who may previously have advocated a deal but not seeing that there's a deal around, suddenly decide that no deal is the option because they can't get what they want, or the form of deal they might desire. It is, I have to say, an extraordinary form of frenzy. You smash up the China first, and when you're not satisfied with the China you smash, you decide to smash some more. And that is what we are facing, and it's my duty to do everything I possibly can to prevent it. And I will continue to do that as long as the opportunities for it present themselves. Yes, of course I give way.
He talks about smashing up the law. Does he not accept that Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act 2018 makes it abundantly clear and expressly that we are going to repeal the European Community Act 1972 on exit day?
May do, but it lies within our capacity to change it. So, and we are going to have to change it, and indeed it is inherent that it is going to be changed in the next fortnight. I'll just move on to that in a moment. I don't want to repeat all the other things that have been said about the risks of no deal in the practice, because I think I don't wish to repeat what others have said perfectly eloquently. So then we turn to the process of this. And I simply point out that it's very unfortunate that what I understood yesterday was going to be a clear opportunity for this House to express itself against the principle of no deal and make quite clear that we don't want it, before moving on tomorrow to discuss what we might do to prevent it, which is a real issue, that the government tabled a motion which gives the distinct impression that, like children, we are going to be offered the same pudding, if not eaten at lunchtime, then at tea time, supper time, and now for breakfast, when it's perfectly clear this House has rejected this particular pudding in its totality. And as a consequence, something which might bring us together in reasoned debate has started to be undermined by suspicion that the government is only interested in forcing a binary choice between no deal and accepting its agreement. Now, listening to the Minister at the dispatch box earlier, I began to realise that perhaps actually that wasn't the case. But then why this was ever tabled in this fashion, I cannot understand. And in fact, the amendment of my right honourable friend, the member for Meriden, was correct in trying to identify and deal with that particular mischief. Now, that said, the government also has a point. The truth, and I agreed so much with a lot of what the member for Birmingham Yardley said, the right honourable lady. There is an issue here. This House has lived under the protection of our party system for a long time. And the distinction which I begin to see on these benches, and actually on the other benches, between those of us who have, in a sense, exposed ourselves, and as a consequence get a huge amount of threat, flack, and invective, and those of my colleagues, not the Prime Minister, I might add, I don't include her in this because she has many a burden, but those of us who are in fact hiding behind the party system to avoid making the difficult choices. And we can't go on doing it because as things stand at the moment, the party system may restore itself. I rather hope it does. But as things stand at the moment, it's blown to pieces. We have got to make the decisions. And those decisions include, are we going to accept the Prime Minister's deal offered up again? I don't want it, because I think it's a poor deal despite her best efforts. Are we going to find some other deal? Or are we going to revoke? Now, revocation is not something which I would wish to do without going back to the public, because it seems to me that in the light of the referendum, that would be a rather draconian and dangerous step. But we're going to have to address that, because otherwise we're going round in circles, and the Minister's right that we're eventually going to run out of time. And we simply pushed back the cliff edge. We are going to have to resolve this. And at the moment, the government is not helping resolve it by tabling amendments of this tendentious character. And I really would urge my colleagues on the front bench to face up to their responsibility and to make sure, firstly, that we get some clarity tonight and we could hear further from them to give it, and secondly, that we can take this debate forward.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always a great pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield, who speaks such wisdom on this issue. Mr. Speaker, if the social and economic catastrophe, which is no deal, were being caused by some kind of natural disaster, there will be a collective outpouring of grief and concern. There will be huge government action to try to mitigate it. There would no doubt be offers of international aid as well. But the fact that this catastrophe is being so actively, willingly, and by some even enthusiastically chosen is the height of masochistic self-indulgence. I doubt that psychologists will spend many years analysing just exactly why this psychosis came to infect so many of our ruling class at this particular time, how we ended up with this concept of masochism as revolt. And no doubt, the desire to create such chaos, the exhilaration that is felt by that is perhaps understandable by those who aren't going to be affected by the results. Those, for example, who could move the investments they might be lucky enough to have to Ireland, just as a random example. But it certainly is going to hurt our constituents who are already struggling in so many cases to get by. The idea that this is being deliberately embraced also at a time when we know of the illegalities associated with the Leave campaign, the evidence of the Russian interference. It is even more shocking that it is being embraced in this way. Looking at Twitter just a few moments earlier, as we're here debating no deal, people like Aaron Banks, the biggest donor to the Leave campaign, the biggest donor ever in British history, is busy going around European governments lobbying them to block any UK request to have any extension of Article 50. So let us just be clear that we are being played for fools here, and that we are going to be responsible for it if we don't wake up and notice it. And for the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath, he has some gall to stand there as if he is completely independent of all of this, that he is not complicit in it, that he is not an architect of it, I think is the height of absolute shamelessness. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have heard so much about the economic costs that are going to ensue as a result of Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, and constituents in Brighton are no exception, and I have been lobbied by so many individuals, families, businesses, universities, Sussex University, where 1 in 4 of the staff are EU citizens, where already they're having problems with recruitment and retention, with research grants and so forth. Similarly, some of the big companies and small companies. But, this goes much more than just being about the economy. What I worry about as well is that a Brexit no deal would make it even harder to even begin to address some of the many reasons that people voted to leave in the first place. Now, of course, there were very many different reasons that people chose to vote to leave. But to the extent that a good many of them were voting to say that the status quo is intolerable, were voting to say that the inequality in this country is grotesque and that they want their communities to have a say in the future, the idea that any of all of that is going to be easier to address if we leave on the basis of no deal is fanciful, it is irresponsible. I think we need to have an honest conversation with the people of this country. We need to level with them, and we need to be saying very clearly that we need a new social contract, that we need better jobs, that we need higher quality public services, that we need investment in the green economy, that we need people of all backgrounds and communities to be treated with respect and given the opportunity and the power to thrive. We need genuinely to give back control to people. We need particularly to put young people at the heart of all of this. Mr. Speaker, we need that kind of future, a Green New Deal, not the Prime Minister's failed deal, or worse still, no deal.
Thank you. Andrew Bridgen.
When we overwhelmingly this House voted to invoke the Article 50 letter, we knew that the default position was that we would leave the European Union on the 29th of March with no deal. My right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, who opened this debate, did so giving his opening speech in his normal, enthusiastic and energetic manner, but his words will have struck horror into the hearts of the 17.4 million people who voted to leave, and indeed to our activists and members across the country. In our manifesto it said that no deal is better than a bad deal, and indeed the Prime Minister has said at that dispatch box on over 100 occasions that we are leaving the European Union on the 29th of March with or without a deal. Where does that leave our democracy, Mr. Speaker, or belief in politics? My right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, spoke at length, as he's wont to do as Father of the House, and I respect him for his consistent opinion with regard to the European Union. He spoke about 3 years ago, and it seems a long time ago almost, the referendum, but I remember well that he led the Remain campaign in the East Midlands, and I led the Leave campaign, and we debated. And we were on television, we were on the radio, we went out on the hustings. And at the end of the day, when the votes came in, and he is right, his seat voted to remain, but it was one of very few in the East Midlands that did. The result was 59 to 41 to leave the European Union in the East Midlands. And I'm very disappointed, as will be the people of the East Midlands, that my right honourable friend, the Father of the House, treats that democratic decision by the East Midlands so badly that he would invite us to revoke Article 50 and go against the will of the British people, something which this House decided we would give the decision to the people in a referendum.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will, of course, give way to my right honourable friend.
As he knows, I never said that I would change my lifelong opinions personally on the strength of one opinion poll, but when we fight an election, and I urge the case for a Conservative government, but the Labour Party win, and the Labour Party take office, does he think it's the rule that I should then attend this House as an opposition member supporting the government's policies because they've just won a democratic mandate for them? That isn't how we conduct politics in this country at all. It would be an absurd way of proceeding.
My right honourable friend makes his point, as he has consistently throughout his career, in favour of the European Union, but the answer is that the people of the East Midlands voted to leave the European Union, and I would hope that he would respect that. We've heard nothing about the preparations by the government to prepare for no deal. They've been played down. There's 9,000 civil servants working on no deal preparations. The Treasury has allocated £4.2 billion of taxpayers' money to prepare for no deal. They are really moving forward on that. Business has been told we're leaving and prepare for no deal on the 29th of March. We've seen on the news that they've reserved warehouse space for extra stock. All that cost has been incurred by our country. And if we leave on the 29th of March, business doesn't like uncertainty. We know that. We end the uncertainty if we leave with no deal on the 29th of March, which we've already heard is not no deal. It is a managed no deal. We have a huge trade deficit with the European Union, £67 billion. We could offer them GATT 24, tariff-free, quota-free trade the moment that we leave, which they'll be very advised to accept, given that they trade with us so much. The European Union is on the verge of a recession. Germany has got no growth. They've only stopped quantitative easing for 3 months since November, and they've slipped into recession. They've started printing money again to support the euro. Now is the time when we've still got economic growth. They need our markets. We should now push forward for more concessions to the European Union. It's not the time to take no deal off the table. It's the time to keep it there as a threat to bring the European Union to heel. When we get to the compression point, it cannot be this Parliament or this country that blinks first. And I urge all colleagues to keep no deal on the table. It's our only insurance to getting out of the European Union.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say it is a real pleasure to follow the honourable member for North East Leicestershire with North West Leicestershire with every word he says. I remind myself of exactly why I took the decision to leave the Conservative Party. Mr. Speaker, the state of the Conservative Party is best embodied now by the honourable member for North West Leicestershire, because if you don't sign up in blood in favour of Brexit, there'll be no place for you in that party any longer. That's the reality of the Conservative Party now that we've had this referendum, and now we have a government that is taking us through and forcing upon this country Brexit, and actually making the case as a member of the Conservative Party, a party that has always prided itself as the party of business, making a positive case for no deal in the face of this Brexit government's own impartial impact assessments, which have shown conclusively that it would be, in the words of the business secretary, who I think might know what he's talking about, would be ruinous for this country. I know who I would rather listen to. The business secretary, not the honourable member for North West Leicestershire. He has probably not even seen them. And even if he has seen them and he's read them, and perhaps even understood them, he would reject them as some Remain conspiracy because it doesn't fit his perfect ideology. And I gently say to him, the day may yet dawn when the good people of North West Leicestershire, as they face the reality of Brexit, though God help us if they ever face the reality of a hard Brexit, and they lose their jobs, and they see the future of their children and their grandchildren reduced because of his words and his actions, I hope they will seek to put the blame where it absolutely lies, with him and all of those who have led this country to make the biggest mistake we have ever made in our history by voting to leave the European Union. And, Mr. Speaker, I will not be part of that. And as the honourable member for Yardley said, unfortunately not in her place, how wisely she spoke. I do not fear my electorate. Good Lord, Mr. Speaker, I was elected with a majority of 389. I can look fear in the face. I understand these things, but I also know this. People respect you if you are honest with them, and if you fight for them, and if you tell it to them as it is. They don't thank you for spin, and they don't thank you for false promises upon which you cannot deliver. Mr. Speaker, just in case you didn't know what was going on, it's fascinating. My right honourable learned friend for Beaconsfield identified the motion is flawed. It doesn't do what this government promised it would do and enable us to vote to take no deal off the table, that awful irresponsibility. And so the right honourable lady for Meridian, she tabled an amendment very wisely which actually did the job and gave that House that opportunity. The Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box and promised a free vote. That is not occurring, Mr. Speaker. There will be no free vote, and now that right honourable lady has been persuaded not to push her amendment. Well, I hope it will be pushed, Mr. Speaker, and I hope people will show the courage that so many honourable and right honourable members have done. Members like the member for East Surrey, who had the courage to resign on a point of principle to do the right thing by his constituents, the right thing by his country. But there's a free vote on another Mickey Mouse amendment which undermines everything the government stands for.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to follow my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, who rightly points out that when you're honest with your constituents and you tell them how it is, they respect you for it. And for my constituents, they have seen that we have discussed the economic consequences of a no-deal Brexit time and time again. I'm disappointed but not surprised that some of my colleagues have chosen the irresponsible course. Given a choice between compromise and chaos, they choose chaos. We all know the facts. No deal can tip us back into recession, will cost the North West jobs and cripple our exports. It would undermine the difficult decisions this government has had to make to strengthen the economy over the last decade. It is time for this House to state clearly no deal is not in the interests of our country or our constituents, and that we will not countenance it. The negotiation is over. The deal is over. No deal is no longer just a threat to drive a hard bargain. It's a threat to our economy and a sign of how unwilling to compromise we are to any future trade partners. I give way.
Giving way. Does she also feel that honourable members should read the letter that they've all received from Professor Andrew Goddard, the President of the Royal College of Physicians today, setting out his stark warning for the health of our patients and the NHS in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
I do, and I also think that constituents ought to remember that a no deal is a threat to the promises that were made during the referendum. Vote Leave said, "Taking back control is a careful change, not a sudden stop. We will negotiate the terms of a new deal before we start any legal process." Well, we know how far that's got. A careful change, not a sudden stop. No deal is the most sudden stop that anyone can envisage. However, it's not just the letter of the promises that would be broken, but the spirit as well. Vote Leave, take back control. For months you couldn't watch TV or listen to the radio without hearing that refrain. Vote Leave, take back control. Well, let's look at how no deal would take back control. It would mean that our farmers would be reliant on the EU to list UK products of animal origin as meeting their import requirements for their countries. It would mean us pleading with the EU to issue an adequacy decision regarding our data protection rules. It would mean years and years of negotiations and trade-offs in order to rebuild a trading partnership that would be a mere shadow of what the Prime Minister's deal offered. All because a few of my colleagues failed to realise that simply walking away does not cause the EU to cease to exist, nor does it mean that its influence will cease. None of this is the control that was promised. It cuts off the control we had within the EU, where we had a say in the making of laws. It cuts off the control the deal gave us by destroying any goodwill and willingness to negotiate that the EU had left in their negotiations with us. No deal condemns us to economic turmoil, and what's more, it does so by betraying the promise of the Leave campaign. I've often been told to respect the referendum result. I did that. I voted for that deal twice. But today I lay that same challenge at the feet of those on this side of the House who think that no deal is worth it. It isn't what you promised. It isn't what 17.4 million people voted for, and it isn't what's best for the country.
Mr. Speaker, the responsibility of any government is to protect its citizen. Protection against threats to our society, whether they concern national security, the health of our economy, or community cohesion. In 2008, the government was very quick to respond to the global financial crisis, but sadly plunged so many into despair. A decade on, many on the benches opposite are actually advocating for a no-deal Brexit, which I believe will make people even more despairing. A destination which, according to the Bank of England, could plunge us into a situation far worse than the 2008 crash. Mr. Speaker, it's unusual for both the CBI and the TUC to speak with one voice, but on the question of a no-deal Brexit, they're both against it. This time it's far worse because the government would consciously and deliberately be inflicting this outcome upon the UK economy and, by extension, upon our communities. It's truly shocking that the Chancellor claimed merely a few hours ago that the government's approach to Brexit was pro-business, and yet so many of the statements appear to be the opposite. My right honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, has clearly detailed the devastating impact such a scenario would have across sectors, from transport to medicines to public finances. And the member for Erdington, the member for Merredin, have made it very clear in both the excellent meetings which they've had in this House about the impact on the manufacturing sector. Mr. Speaker, I briefly wanted to mention small business because they too are affected. A woman in my constituency who runs a fashion business, and let's not forget that fashion accounts for £35 billion, fishing for £1.8 billion. That's just a small comparison. But she said to me, "Dear Catherine, I thought I would share with you an email that I received from a client in Denmark who no longer wishes to trade with us. It's self-explanatory. Dear Sandra, thank you for your email. With England leaving the EU, we've decided to focus on distributors from within the EU to avoid issues at the border, from Martin in Denmark. And up and down the country, small business is coping with this day in, day out. We've seen companies, trade unions, charities, the NHS, watchdogs all coalesce around the view that a no-deal Brexit will inflict chronic economic hardship upon us all. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, it will fray even more the delicate fabric which holds us all together. The tone of the national debate has plummeted since Brexit became our national conversation around dinner tables. That's why I'm proud to have co-signed Amendment A, and I'm very keen still to move it, unless others can persuade me otherwise. I recognise that many honourable members on the benches opposite are not actively advocating for a no-deal outcome, but with days to go before we crash out, we all must recognise that declining to vote for Amendment A, or at least taking it seriously, will make them complicit in such an outcome should occur. We have 373 hours left until the UK leaves the EU. I hope all members will reflect upon the specific ways in which a no-deal scenario will have that impact upon households, upon businesses, in our schools, in our workplaces, and recognise that damage, and with the knowledge I hope they will vote to avert this chaos. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Samjima.
Mr. Speaker, this, I believe, is one of the most important debates in the Brexit process, because we decide whether in just over 2 weeks we would leave the EU with some deal, do something else, or we have a rupture of 45 years of a relationship that permeates every aspect of life in this country. In that context, we have a responsibility, clearly, to the 17.4 million people who voted leave. But we also have a duty, by which I mean this Parliament, but also the government, to the 66 million citizens in this country and their safety and their livelihoods. Every decision we take in the context of leaving with no deal has to be looked like that. Now, some people have talked about leaving with no deal as though it is some kind of inconvenience. There will be a little bit of disruption, like your BT internet going down for a few hours. Others have gone to the other extreme and said it is not like Dunkirk. Well, nobody said to anyone during the referendum campaign that vote leave and you'd have to invoke the spirit of Dunkirk. Nobody, that is, I say, an incredibly low bar to set for success of this particular project. Now, many people...
When we joined the European Union, food prices went up 10%. We severed trading links with historic allies like Australia and New Zealand. Did anyone ever say we crashed into the European Union?
What I am talking about is a rupture after 45 years. Now, many people cite our manifesto, which says we will leave the single market, the customs union, and be outside the jurisdiction of the ECJ as justification for this. But that same manifesto also says we will leave with clarity and certainty. There is no way and no world under which leaving without a deal provides clarity and certainty about our future relations. And all the challenges we have with the Prime Minister's deal, which is that there is no vision, there is no clarity, our bargaining position is weakened, that we would have to go cap in hand with the EU, and we will be able to apply even more so in the case of no deal, because we will be a distressed negotiator. Now, those who say that somehow leaving means you don't need any deals at all, it's just not true at all. What you do is you leave, and on day one, you don't have a deal, but you rapidly have to negotiate a whole set of deals. We will be at the mercy, we will have to rely on the kindness of strangers in order to be able to do so. So should you have no deal on the table just for negotiating purposes? Well, the EU knows that for a country that has been able to sign on to the PM's deal, where we leave our voice, our vote and our veto in return for best endeavours, we are not serious about no deal. They do not take that position. It is not a credible negotiating position at all. Now, but also, when we say that WTO is better for us, we also then say, well, we want to negotiate other trade deals. So why leave from the preferential position to go out and then try and negotiate something better in terms of no deal? It just does not make sense, and it is not credible either. Now, this idea keeps rearing its head in different ways. It's a managed no deal. It's a WTO Brexit. These are all rebrands of the same idea. It means we are leaving without any arrangements. We are setting sail without knowing where we are going. Now, I'm willing to entertain the prospect that it could work. Maybe in 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, or 50 years down the line, as the member for North East Somerset said, it could work. But in the meantime, what would we have done to people's lives in this country? What about manufacturing, or the farmers in my constituency who came and saw me and said, if no deal goes ahead, we're completely wiped out? Now, what I would say is that is so much of this is about trade, is about tariffs, and it's about borders, but we forget about the people that we're here to represent, or it's easy to forget so. But what will happen if we were to leave on the 29th of March without a deal is that we will be on a war footing when there is no external threat. We will have a massive civil contingency, and the Prime Minister would stand in front of Downing Street on Independence Day, having to say to the country, do not worry, we will manage all the traffic jams. Do not worry, we will make sure you get your medicine. I have now sent the Trade Minister to go and negotiate all those mini deals. Do not worry, it will be all right. And that will be because the government has chosen, of all the negotiable options available, the one that caused the most disruption to people's lives. In what sense? In what world will that be a victory for this country? In what sense, in that world, can we say to those who voted leave, this is the vision that was given to you during the referendum campaign? There is no world in which that is right.
To the honourable gentleman. Owen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a great pleasure to follow the member for East Surrey, who spoke just as eloquently as his fellow Surrey MP on the front bench, but I think rather more truthfully about the perils that Brexit poses to our country, a no-deal Brexit or any other sort of Brexit. Mr. Speaker, in the 10 years since I've been an MP, I think we've lived through some extraordinary political moments. Things that have seemed entirely impossible have come to pass. But even in this surreal age, it does seem to me that today's debate, low-key though it has been in many measures, is a particularly extraordinary, surreal moment, because we are debating here in the British Parliament the prospect of voting or not voting for a policy that the British government has declared is going to cut 10% out of our GDP, out of our economy over the next 15 years. That is going to reduce the size of our economy by £200 billion over the next 15 years. It is utterly inconceivable, Mr. Speaker, in this era or in any other era, that anybody sensible can possibly vote for a policy that is going to cut more than twice what we spend on the NHS each year out of our economy. And in an era, in a recent era in which we have schools closing on Friday afternoons because they can't afford to stay open, in an era in which we have teachers being stabbed, it feels, almost weekly on our streets because of a dearth of police officers in this country, in an era in which the head of the NHS is telling the government they need to deprivatise the NHS and invest in it. It is entirely inconceivable that this Parliament or any Parliament could vote to do such damage to our public services and to our people. So I don't think there is any prospect, Mr. Speaker, of this House, save for a few on that side voting for that outcome. I don't think there was ever any prospect of no deal really being pursued by this government. It has been a blackmail negotiating tactic by the government's front bench to hold all of our feet to the flames and try and ram through a Brexit deal. And therefore I want very briefly to say we all know that any version of Brexit is going to diminish our economy. Any version of Brexit is a jobs-eating Brexit. Even the version advocated by the government front bench, by their own admission, will cut not 200 billion, but between 40 and 60 billion out of our GDP. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, we must obviously vote against no deal tonight, and we must obviously vote in favour of an extension to the Article 50 tomorrow. But we must also be honest with the people of this country. And I say this to my front bench as much as I say it to the government front bench. We must be honest with them that Brexit in any regard is going to damage the livelihoods and opportunities of our constituents. And we in the Labour Party should be opposing it for that, if for no reason other than that. I want to close by saying I thought my friend, the Honourable Member for Yardley, spoke courageously and eloquently this evening. She's absolutely right. We shouldn't be frightened of speaking truth, not just to power, but to our constituents. If that means that my party wishes to deselect me, if that means that my constituents wish to not vote for me in the next election, well, so be it. But I will do so knowing that my conscience is clear, that I didn't vote for Article 50, that I won't vote for a Tory Brexit, that I will not vote for a Labour Jobs First Brexit, but I will vote tonight to do the country a service and stop no-deal Brexit at all costs.
Extremely grateful. 3 minutes. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer members to my business interests as listed in the Register of Members' Interests. Can I just very briefly, if I may, Mr. Speaker, encourage a note of moderation when talking about no deal? I, and many of us, if not all of us, prefer a good deal to no deal. That's one of the key logics of actually leaving the European Union. But may I suggest that WTO is not the so-called disaster that everybody is suggesting. We have to look to economic reality. We trade profitably with the rest of the world outside the EU on largely WTO no-deal terms. What people can forget is that investment is about comparative advantage. It's about the extent that your corporation tax rates are lower, how more flexible your labour markets are, your top universities, your financial expertise. In aggregate, they are more important than WTO tariffs. And if the proof were needed, we only have to look at how well this country is doing economically in the face of so-called concern that we could be leaving the EU on no-deal terms. Those investment decisions over recent years have been made in the full knowledge that we could be leaving on no-deal terms. Briefly.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that the truth is that many of those in this chamber who wish to take no deal off the table, the actual truth is they want to stop Brexit, but they haven't got the guts to admit it to the electorate because they know that 2/3 of our constituencies voted to leave the European Union?
I think, unfortunately, there's an element of truth in that, but I wouldn't want to label everybody in that camp. Mr. Speaker, what I would suggest is, to many honourable members who have quoted predictions about the future, I think we've got to keep the argument and the debate grounded in reality. I think people need to remember
that there were many predictions of economic woe and gloom should we vote to leave the EU in 2016. They came from the Bank of England, the IMF, businesses, the various sector organisations and public organisations. And some of the predictions were suggesting 500,000, 700,000 extra unemployed by December 2016. What happened? Actually, we created jobs. Economic growth did well. And we actually, now today, have a record low unemployment rate, which is half the EU average. We have record manufacturing output, and we have record inward investment. So I think we need to be careful of predictions, because as Mark Carney recognised, Governor of the Bank of England, the Bank of England had to publicly apologise for getting it so wrong, as did so many others. And we have been told by our own government that actually the preparations for no deal are in full swing. When I asked the Prime Minister on the 12th of February, is the government ready? Can she reassure the House that should we leave on the 29th of March on no deal WTO terms, we are sufficiently prepared? Her response was just 3 words: we are indeed. So the preparations have been made, and I think we should take some comfort from that. So in short, Mr. Speaker, all I would say is that ruling out no deal makes a bad deal more likely. I think there needs to be an element of moderation across the House when describing no deal. The economic reality is at variance to the various doomsday forecasts which were proved so wrong back in 2016, and we should take note of that fact.
Really grateful. Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to wind up this debate for the opposition. And it's been a good debate. It was opened by the Environment Secretary, who made a powerful case for why a no-deal Brexit should be opposed, and by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, who, as he always does, rose to the occasion with his usual rigour and honesty. It's been a good debate, as I said, Mr. Speaker, and among others, we've had passionate contributions from the right honourable gentleman, the member for Leeds Central, my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, the right honourable and learned gentleman, the member for Rushcliffe and Beaconsfield, and the honourable members for Birmingham, Yardley, East Surrey and Eddisbury, all of whom spoke with great force. Mr. Speaker, what I have taken from today's debate is that exiting the EU without an agreement is not simply one amongst several equivalent Brexit options. It is in a category of its own. Everyone will have their own views on the balance of strengths and weaknesses of other options, whether that be a Canadian-style free trade agreement or a Norway-style arrangement, and the appropriateness of the trade-offs and compromises involved in each. But those options can at least be contemplated rationally on the basis of their likely consequences for our economy and our security, their implications for the Irish border, and their chances of successfully emerging from the detailed negotiations on the future relationship. Mr. Speaker, in contrast, it is hard to overstate how damaging a no-deal exit from the EU in just over a fortnight would be, and speech after speech today has brought that home. A no-deal Brexit is simply not a viable option. Indeed, an exit from the EU on the 29th of March without agreement, or indeed any date thereafter, will be nothing short of a national disaster, a point that we on this side of the House have endlessly repeated over the past 2 years. A no-deal Brexit would affect every facet of our national life and every region and nation of the UK. It would bring to an end, at a stroke, the whole body of legal arrangements that exist between the UK and the EU, plunging us into a legal and regulatory vacuum. The focus of much of today's debate has rightly been on the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the economy, and for good reason, given the implications for businesses and individuals across the UK. The implications of crashing out without a deal on the 29th of March would be significant, both in terms of lost growth over the long term and the grievous dislocation that we face in the short term. The proposals for tariffs under a no-deal exit that the government published this morning, without any consultation with business, merely serve to underline what a disastrous outcome a no-deal exit would be. But, Mr. Speaker, The impact of a no-deal departure is about much more than just tariffs. It would mean a sudden and drastic change in the entire body of rules that currently govern how we trade in a range of crucial areas. It would threaten the complex law enforcement and judicial cooperation arrangements that keep Britain safe. It would almost inevitably result in infrastructure being placed on the Irish border, place untold strain on the Good Friday Agreement and Anglo-Irish relations more generally, and exacerbate the current political instability in Northern Ireland, raising the spectre, as the Secretary for the Environment said at the outset, of direct rule from Westminster. In short, Mr. Speaker, such an exit is the hardest and most chaotic of departures. It provides no certainty, and no one can say with any real certainty just how extensive the damage would be. Now, of course we'd survive, Mr. Speaker, but why would any government force the British people to cope with an entirely avoidable act of self-harm, which opinion polling suggests only a minority of the public support? No responsible government in their right mind should countenance a no-deal exit from the EU, especially when the other party, as the honourable member for East Surrey, who's not in his place, brought home in his contribution, when the other side knows full well that it has always been a hollow threat. And the tragedy is, Mr. Speaker, that instead of simply announcing that under no circumstances will the UK leave the EU without a deal, this government adopted such an outcome as their official plan B, endlessly repeating over months the nonsensical mantra that no deal is better than a bad deal, in a way that I believe desensitised many people in our country to the risks involved. And they've also spent, as the SNP spokesman said in his contribution, significant sums of public money trying to ensure they're prepared for it. And trying is the operative word, Mr. Speaker, because we know from the government's own impact assessment summary that the UK is simply not prepared to leave the EU on the 29th of March. Leave aside the legislative burden that still needs to be faced. Those impact assessments make clear that the departments are on track for just over two-thirds of the most critical projects. And it's honest about the fact that in the event of a no-deal exit, the UK would be at the mercy of the actions of the European Commission, EU member states and EU businesses. And that brings me to my next point, Mr. Speaker, which is that there is no such thing as a managed no deal.
Order. Order. There's a lot of background noise. I'm not sure the acoustics are as helpful as they might be, and I apologise, order, to the honourable gentleman for that, but can I urge him to project? Speak up, man. We want to hear you.
I shall do my best, Mr. Speaker. It brings me to my next point. As I said, there is no such thing as a managed no deal, despite the protestations of the more cavalier members on the benches opposite. It is a myth, and it's why the idea of a no deal as an act of national liberation is so misleading. Not only would the government in all likelihood lose control of events in a no deal scenario, but it would inevitably end up supplicating itself before the EU. Just read the government's own technical notices. They make clear that in a swathe of areas, a no-deal scenario requires agreement from Brussels. And if anyone thinks, amid the acrimony that would exist following a no-deal exit, that the EU is going to ride to the rescue and agree to a raft of reciprocal mini-deals in all the essential areas required, a waiver of the Union's rules, or a standstill transition period without a withdrawal agreement, as Amendment F suggests, just remind ourselves of the Commission's plans for no-deal exit. Those plans make absolutely clear that the EU will only agree to cooperative measures where strictly necessary, where it's in their own interests. They make clear that plans could not replicate the benefits of membership of the Union, and they state plainly that they could be revoked at any time. It's yet another example. I won't give way because I want to make sure the Secretary of State has sufficient time. It's yet another example, Mr. Speaker, of the misplaced confidence that has defined the approach of the hardliners on the benches opposite. And just like the notion of a cost-free, no-deal exit, it is a fantasy. And that is why so many honourable and right honourable members on the benches opposite, including many members of the Cabinet, know, whether they've said so publicly or not, that no-deal exit is not a viable option and it must be ruled out. Mr. Speaker, this House has already made its intentions clear in relation to a no-deal exit on two separate occasions. And I agree with the comments that have been made from all quarters today that it is disappointing the way that the government have framed their motion. At worst, it's contradictory. At best, it's ambiguous. And as the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield said, it certainly raises suspicions. It's of course a statement of fact that the current legal default remains that the UK leaves the EU on the 29th of March. And if we rule out a no-deal exit tonight, we'll of course have to amend the EU Withdrawal Act accordingly, just like we would have had to amend it if the government's deal had passed yesterday. And we will have to agree to an extension of the Article 50 process so that an alternative way forward can be found. Both are a given. But the only question before us this evening, Mr. Speaker, is does this House, in principle, definitively rule out a no-deal exit under any circumstances? No other question needs to be determined today, and that's why our preference is to support Amendment A. Mr. Speaker, there are only 16 days left now until the 29th of March. The possibility of a no-deal exit, whether by accident or design, is still very real, as the Father of the House made clear in his contribution. It is time we made a no-deal Brexit an impossibility, and this could be our last chance to do so. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I urge honourable and right honourable members from across the House to decisively rule out a no-deal Brexit this evening so that we can turn our attention as a House tomorrow to shaping what happens next.
Secretary of State for International Trade, Secretary Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, this has been a useful debate, if not unpredictable, in its contributions. My right honourable friend, the member for Meriden, made one of the key points in her intervention earlier, when she said, we in this House, we're not given a request by the British public to leave the European Union. We were given an instruction by the British public to leave the European Union. This House triggered Article 50. This House set the date for leaving as the 29th of March. And as my right honourable friend, the member for Wokingham, pointed out, 80% of the members of this House were elected on a manifesto commitment to honour the result of the referendum, not something we should take lightly. Now, Mr. Speaker, I accept that many of those who seek a delay to Brexit have a range of motives, and I think an ounce of civility would sometimes do well in some of our proceedings. I accept that some seek a delay out of a genuine fear of what no deal might produce and want more preparations to be undertaken. But there are also some in this House, and we know it to be true, who seek to defy and reverse the result of the referendum itself. And we in this House need to understand the democratic disaster that would await us if we took that course. Now, many of us, Mr. Speaker, have made a number of compromises to be able to support the Prime Minister's agreement. And I pay tribute to the Prime Minister's tenacity and simple good manners in the way that she has dealt with the House. But if we are to leave the European Union in line with the instruction, it's a menu with limited options. We either leave with a deal, and the only deal available is the Prime Minister's deal at the present time, or we leave with no deal, with unavoidable consequences. I'm not giving way. The alternative is to revoke Article 50 and have no Brexit at all, with unavoidable and unforeseeable consequences. Now, this motion, Mr. Speaker, focuses on the date of the 29th of March. At that point, we either have to leave with a deal in line with Article 50, or leave with no deal, for which the risks have been set out, or if we choose neither of these, then we have to have an extension of Article 50. Either to make administrative changes for a deal that may already have been negotiated, or to simply have an extension when we don't know what the point will necessarily be. And let me say on this extension, it is not in our gift unilaterally to grant such an extension. Secondly, it requires unanimity among all 27 other European countries. And thirdly, we cannot know what price might be extracted from the United Kingdom for that extension. It is not an easy option for the House or the country to take. Now, what are the alternatives to the government's policy? We were told at the outset of the debate by the Shadow Brexit Secretary that Labour have repeatedly warned us about X, Y and Z. Nothing could be further from the truth. We've had nothing but inconsistency from the Labour front bench. The Labour leader didn't want another referendum. Now he does want another referendum, despite the fact the Shadow Foreign Secretary says it's telling Labour voters they're stupid. The Shadow Brexit Secretary wants a referendum but won't put down an amendment to say that it can happen. Labour said that they wanted to end free movement of people. Now they want to be part of the single market all over again. They said they want an independent trade policy, but what they have is simply legally impossible because the European Union rules do not allow a third country to have an influence on EU trade policy. No, Mr. Speaker. I've made clear that in the 9 minutes which I accepted to give other members time, I'll not be giving way. Mr. Speaker, for much of this debate, I didn't recognise the country that was being described as the country that I live in. A country that seemed by many to be described as isolated, inept, intimidated by its own future. I believe in the future of this country. We are not passengers in our own destiny. We are able to control our own future. This is a country with exports at record levels. This is a country which last year, when global foreign direct investment fell 40%, it went up 20% in the United Kingdom. A country with employment at an all-time high. More consecutive quarters of growth than any other G7 country. A country which is producing these results under good Conservative management. And nor, Mr. Speaker, did I understand the picture painted about the deals already, the preparations already made for no deal, because we have spent a great deal of time, and our civil service has spent a great deal of time on the mitigations. Pharmaceutical companies, I'm not taking into it. Pharmaceutical companies ensuring adequate stocks, increased air freight capacity. We've set our new tariff policies for day one, liberalising our economy so that 87% of our imports will be tariff-free, setting up a trade remedies authority to protect our steel industry and our ceramics. And the EU has also made its own preparations. We need to keep some balance in this debate, Mr. Speaker.
Much gesticulation. The right honourable and learned gentleman, the member for Rushcliffe, is seeking to intervene, but it is for order. It is for the Secretary of State to decide, and as I understand it, he's aware of the intended intervener, but does not wish to take the intervention.
Mr. Speaker, the Father of the House already had longer time to make his contributions than I've had today. I want to answer the direct question asked of me earlier. I want to answer the direct question asked of the Right Honourable Member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford. She asked a very direct question. Is the result of this vote that the default position is that we will not leave the EU on the 29th of March without a withdrawal agreement? That is the result of the motion that we're debating tonight. But I have to say to the Right Honourable Lady that the only way to take no deal off the table in the longer term is to have a negotiated deal, unless we are to revoke Article 50 and have no Brexit. There is no worse outcome for this House and this country and our democracy than to have no Brexit. We have been given a clear instruction by the people of Britain. In the days ahead, we in this House must decide who in our democracy are the masters and who are the servants. We heard from the Honourable Lady, the member for Bath, what can only be described as a diatribe about the will of the people, which she derided. I happen to believe that when this House contracts out its sovereignty on an issue, which we did on the European Union, and we tell the people of Britain that we will accept what decision they take, we are honour and duty bound to take that decision. And when she says the will of the people doesn't matter, it may not matter to the Liberal Democrats, it does to the Conservative Party. For me, Mr. Speaker, this is ultimately a decision about our democratic values.
Order. I fear it's more a point of frustration. No impropriety. Order. I accept she may be irritated, but the Right Honourable Gentleman is not giving way. Now is not a time for points of order. Later, if she wants to do so, I'll take it. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, for me, what we are engaged in is the most important democratic debate in this country's history. the British people have given our Parliament a clear instruction. It is time for us to determine who is the boss.
Order! Under the order of the House of today, I must now put the questions necessary to dispose of proceedings on the motion. We begin